Well, Peter, you're awesome. And I've always really enjoyed your insight in the Hegel classes and your work and your thinking. And anytime I've had a chance to speak with you. And so I know you do a lot in Daniel Dennett. I know you do a lot of Hegel. I have to, what is your interest? What have you been working on? I'm just really interested in your thought in general, because it's always so insightful. So thank you for your time, Peter.
Well, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate that because, not being an academic philosopher or having spent a great deal of time reading and writing academically for the last 30 years after doing an undergraduate in 93 to 97. But, living in a new age community and coming here 23 years ago, it was certainly fascinating to encounter such a diverse range of worldviews, ones that very often confronted my own scientific rationalist worldview. And certainly that led to a lot of great conversations and also a lot of very challenging conversations. So I'd always considered myself, because of certain past experiences, but just my own nature, to be a questioning being. That somehow my own deepest self-identity was with the question, and that in itself opened up well, pretty much everything. And the very nature of self, the very nature of my own subjective reality, consciousness, existence, God, the universe, everything is just basically has a big question mark next to it. And hopefully that question will lead to some new questions. And then there's the thrill of the experiential reality of facing them, asking them, going down all those rabbit holes, even on their own inner inquiry around things. And so that's been a very, very fruitful exercise for me. But along the way, I also noticed, especially just in real life, as it were, in regular social life, that people might often express something, sort of a deeply sort of cherished aspect of the way that they live in their own life, or the value that they hold, or a value system that they hold. And I kind of wade in like a bull in a china shop, not really understanding that other people aren't like me in that regard. And before you know it, I'm getting some very strange looks and a little bit, pissed off and aggressive looks. And I'm like, wow, okay, so it really taught me a lot about how much people at that time, that I thought that, wow, people could so be wedded to their beliefs and wedded to their views on things. And I suppose as I've got older and gone through my own the highs and lows of life and experience, and some very deep lows at times. And sometimes it pays to have some sort of solid ground to hold on to for a while, And so I've come to have much more compassionate, nuanced appreciation for how people navigate through life and what values they hold to live a flourishing life in ways that I had never really looked at or addressed within myself, So that was been an education in all sorts of levels. But then also going back to my undergraduate, which was in 93, somewhere around September 93 I started. Well, that's Northern Hemisphere summer. Around July, August before that, I stumbled upon Dennett's book Consciousness Explained. And that was really fantastic, because before starting the undergraduate degree, I had this kind of vantage point, maybe not a very high one, you might consider, some might consider, but a vantage point nonetheless that allowed me to have a point of reference to pretty much all the other philosophers that I studied. And I did come across quite a lot of the phenomenologists like Brentano and Husserl, and courses in Nietzsche and Sartre and Heidegger and Kierkegaard. So I had a lot of exposure to kind of the sort of idealist continental tradition there, but again, through the lens of kind of from the vantage point of Dennett and this materialist perspective. So that grounded me in a certain way. And I was also, indulging in psychedelics and other experiences. So I remember, sometimes smoking a lot of pot and, going out the door to a lecture, and you open the door and the sky, there's the sky. I'd be like, is the sky really blue? Like you'd have these really deep kind of young philosophical mind questions, at least for me, about some very basic elements, seemingly basic elements of reality. So that was definitely quite a journey intellectually and spiritually, if you like. Fast forwarding 25, 30 years, and then opting to do this Hegel course with Cadell Last, and doing a little bit of pre-reading on the phenomenology of spirit, which was fantastic because I live in a spiritual community, and obviously I live in a spiritual religious world. So really trying to have a very deep understanding of those aspects of myself, of the lives of others, of spirit more generally, if there is such a thing outside the lives of others and myself. And then Hegel's Science of Logic, which was what the course was primarily about, and really coming to appreciate the potential limitations of Aristotelian syllogistic formalism in logic, and how Hegel has been understood and misunderstood and represented and misrepresented, reacted to in so many ways over the last 200 years. And I really appreciate how Cadell and another contingent of young philosophers are really, taking the bull by the horns and looking at how this deep philosophical work can be brought to bear on everyday life. As I think I saw one of the guys from Theory Underground say, that if theory can't be applied to everyday life, then it's not worth the paper it's written on. And it's strange that Hegel is seemingly one of the loftiest and densest of ivory tower philosophers, and yet not really. It's so directly applicable in so many ways. And so I'll try to not waffle on for too long, but in the course, over that period of time, not only learning the material in such a rich and dense and efficient way from Cadell, and some of that sinking in at various speeds in my sort of intellectual understanding. But then what I found after the course finished, which was around May, which I think was the last time we had some interaction with each other in the course, what I found was, my own personal life going through certain roller coasters, or at least holding the car on the track while I careened along it, trying not to come off it in a few personal ways. But then noticing that the way that I would think about things and the way that I'd be responding to people about things, just almost through a process of osmosis as much as any sort of intellectual comprehension, which of course I think was there to some degree, that I started to think in Hegelian terms. I'd think in terms of the negation and the sublation and negation of the negation, and then tangentially through the course, other philosophers and psychoanalysts that I hadn't studied, like Freud and Lacan and Girard and others, that even more deeply on Nietzsche as well, where there are these general themes around the abyss, the lack, the unconscious, the subconscious, and even Lacan's separation out about the symbolic real and other forms of real. And what is it that's beyond that? And in fact, what if am I even referring to when I think I'm referring to that? Is that still stuck within some sort of internal projection and beyond that? So that kind of led me to thinking about the branching. Again, sitting on the materialist branch to some degree, having deep dived in the direction of idealism, and thought very deeply about this subject-object divide over my 30 years with Dennett, and the materialist construal and the modern. As you say a bit about that there is thinkers like Michael Graziano and Thomas Metzinger, Patricia Churchland, all. And I think there's Tononi in integrated information theory, and there's this whole set of materialist thinkers about consciousness who seemingly aligned with the sort of neuroscientific developments and research, coming towards what the Dennett has called in fact, it might not have been Dennett, it might have been Graziano, towards a standard model of consciousness. A rather grand claim in could it ever be as robust as something like the quantum mechanical standard model, and yet what these thinkers in these theorists within this tradition are noticing, that they're really actually got a lot of the same conceptual frameworks, relationships and hierarchies, using different vocabulary, and that actually it's all now sort of circling around something that looks a lot like Michael Graziano's attention schema theory of consciousness. And yet somehow again, through this idealist lens that I've picked up, how could I characterize it? It's almost as if to say that the description of the thing can never be the thing, as it were. And it's just sort of the fundamental kind of like mismatch in the sort of like a categorical error that, you know, even if we had this perfect theory of consciousness, and everyone, potentially every human born today or in the future, could read that and go, oh yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, that's just, you know, it's perfect. Yeah, so it's just, that's it. Like, everyone's going to be convinced by this. It's so robust, it's so rich, it's so explanatory. It's tied into the rest of the scientific worldview. My subjective experience is effectively an illusion, but it's a real illusion, and so on and so forth. There is still somehow, one might call it a bad taste in the mouth, one that I didn't really have for 30 years. I was quite happy to drink the Kool-Aid there, and wonderful research and ongoing blah, 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 blah. But then Hegel, you know, and everything I was saying up until this point, I was beginning to think about the point where the materialists and the, let's call it the immaterialists, diverged. I think that comes back to Bishop Berkeley, I think in the 17th century, and his philosophy of immaterial. It has this beautiful bit about the dialogue between Hylas and Philanaus, one being the philosopher, one being the friend, and pointing out effectively that all you can really say is that there is sense perception, at least in the conscious awareness of the sense perception. But then thinking about that in a modern scientific terms, that we have the brain and the nervous system, and some flesh and some hormones and some, you know, the endocrine system and so on. But effectively, you've got your neurons running all the way down into the tips of your fingers and controlling your capillaries and your capacity for sense and your sensitivity to touch. And then from the evolutionary theory, you've got your fight or flight mechanism. So, you know, a very visceral, real sense, you know, the creature, the mouse is foraging there at night. So it's like, although it's not thinking the same thoughts that we as hominids might think of, like, is that a leopard in the shadows? Oh no, it's okay. It was just a rustling in the trees. So there's this visceral response to the senses, right? This is where the point of connect to, let's call it external reality, appears to be. It's the interfaces right there. The most immediate aspect of it is this conversion into spike trains in neurons, as Dennett might put it. And yet Berkeley refuted that. He at least pointed out that if you want to say that there is an external cause, what he called material substance, that is the cause of that, you are making an inference at best and not a deduction. Mm. So then I see, well, the scientists and the scientific types go, all right, well, we're going to take that inference, we're going to make that inference, we're going to assume that there is something out there, which I think is a very reasonable thing to do. It might sound a bit obvious to say that from one perspective. Of course it is. But Berkeley didn't. You know, it's like, no, it's still all mental phenomena. And living in this community that I do, there does appear to be sort of extrapolating this fundamental dichotomy between consciousness is the ground of all existence, and it's out of which the world emerges, reality emerges. And there's a lot to be said for that point of view I'd like to come back to, but I'll certainly let you talk in just a moment. And or is external objective reality the ground of all existence, out of which consciousness emerges, obviously through a very, very long process of the evolution of life over billions of years in order to produce animals and beings like us that have a conscious mind. But nonetheless emergent. And I like, personally, just to finish off on that tangent, I like the idea, and I'll come back to this in next time I talk, is that consciousness, I think, I'm a non-dualist, or at least a monist in this regard. I think that there is one continuum of existence, you know, and it runs all the way up into the mental, the subjective, the reality of my being aware that I'm existing in each moment. I think there is no real distinguish point. There's no sort of point at which some emergence from the neural correlates of consciousness into something new that is non-physical. I don't think that's going on personally. Nonetheless, there's a lot to unpack there. So, but this branching point goes all the way back to Berkeley, and it's somehow in there, I think, coming back where I think I've had a lot of sort of juicy conjectures around how to bring these branches that have been diverging for 300 years, at least some ideas around how that might be brought back together. And maybe it is just a language game, but hopefully it's something that might lead someone to have a sort of experiential recognition, perhaps, of something that strikes a chord, that, you know, method that actually can then bridge between the two in a fluid way. It's a little bit like interfacing between C++ and Fortran. You know, you kind of got to be able to translate between the two if you've got to do certain kinds of, right? Anyway, that's my philosophical journey in a nutshell.
Well, that was unbelievably magnificent. So, Peter, that was gold. So a few things. First, what you were saying from Dennett scientism into philosophy, I feel like a lot of connection with that because, you know, I started off with a lot of economics and actually very, very skeptical of theory or ideas because a lot of people have big ideas of how to make the world a better place and they simply destroy the supply chain. They simply destroy the coordination of prices and all sorts of different problems. So very, very skeptical. And I started off very much in like the counter enlightenment, Vico, Scottish Enlightenment, all of these thinkers for whom philosophy was the biggest problem of philosophy, actually. Like there's this whole branch of philosophical thinking that I basically think has been ignored and overlooked because it doesn't fit into a neat box. People tend to know about the counter enlightenment with Vico, Harman, you know, people like that. But when I actually think there was another branch called the modern counter enlightenment of thinkers of whom realized thought was its own problem. Like, because if you think a thought, it is presenting itself in a certain way of being rational and all you need for understanding. And that makes you very prone to then think, oh, I don't need experience. I don't need observation. I don't need the scientific method. Because thought itself, if I can just learn how to master the structures of thought by its own logic, the coherence of thought will then give me a model that very coherence means I should make the world try to correspond with it. And then you get various terrors, basically. And I think Adorno and Horkheimer talk about how the Enlightenment leads to world wars and totalitarian. I mean, there are people like Hume talking about philosophical consciousness who are warning about that. So you have this real, like, deep awareness of also just seeing how ideas tend to create so many problems in societies, actually. But then on the flip side, if you don't have ideas and you don't have philosophical training, then somebody comes along that can manipulate you, or they have some ideological structure and you're taken off. Also, like you were talking about the wonder of looking at the sky or these different questions, you know, for me, like one of the biggest kind of, oh, we can't avoid philosophy or abstract reasoning was things like self-deception. You know, if you think about self-deception, makes no sense. Like, how is it possible for a self to be self-deceived? That makes no sense. How is irony possible? Like, irony is where a person does X thinking and they're going to get Y, and that's precisely why they don't get Y. That makes no sense. How can people intend something, and then when they get that thing, they don't want it? Like, there were all, it became very clear to me that the brain was the frenemy. It's your friend, but it's also the enemy. But the only thing you have to fight the frenemy is that frenemy. Oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? And so the thing is, like, you know, I've always, you know, I had a big pull to things like pragmatism, a lot of like, you know, Peirce, Richard Rorty and different things. But then it became very clear to me that pragmatism and even David Hume could not provide you the resources by which to think through your own thinking. And also it was not able to fight ideology. It was not able to defend from political projects. And also, like, you know, I really love Mark Edmondson. He's a poetry professor at UVA, and he wrote a piece basically warning. He said, look, neo-pragmatism had no way to stop Trump, or like different, like kind of big strongman movements. And it doesn't, you know, not to get into politics, but the point is, like, pragmatism without any structure of ideals or values or metaphysical claims, well, then if you say it's all power, you know, like a Foucault, and Foucault is more complicated than that, but that's a generality. well, then it's all power. And whoever can like practically figure out how to get the power or how to control people, how do you say that's wrong? On what basis do you say that's wrong? And also, too, if you get sucked into that without philosophical training, you're probably not going to be able to stop yourself from getting sucked back into this. So there was this kind of dearth, if you will. There was kind of like, I thought like I did a lot in economics literature and different things, but there was this kind of like, oh, there's something missing here. And in 2015, 2016, then I got into all what I call the philosophical sociologists like Berger, Philip Reef, all these different people who kind of warned about when you have the loss of societal givens because of pluralism, then people become very existentially anxious and they tend to turn to power. And the only way to stop that is to have some kind of training where you don't fall into this. And what's really interesting to me is it's almost like there's a skill set that's kind of hard to put into words that philosophy can introduce to you. It's like it's practical, but it's also not reducible to practice. And the only word we have for it is philosophy, but it's kind of hard to use because people associate that with giant metaphysical systems. But like to me, what is the skill to avoid self-deception? Is that abstract? Is that concrete? It's kind of in this weird middle zone. Like it's not a mere idea, but it's also not a mere practice. And there's some sort of flexibility of thought that seems required. And I think you were pointing at this, like after you take the, oh, and also what blew my mind was in fact like Cadell, like going through Hegel and being like, oh my gosh, Hegel is not the giant boogeyman you thought he was. He is this complicated middle space dealing with the concrete, the inherent abstraction of concretion. Like this is the weird, like the abstract is always seeking to be known in the concrete, of which then makes the concrete not reducible. Well, that's weird. How do you live with that? What does that mean? And then this whole kind of space opens up that for me, like as much as I love Hume and will defend Hume, and I think he's direly misread, is that there's a limitation there that has to be taken seriously. And there were some limitations to the economists that I would work on, even if they had good points. And so that kind of opens up that whole space of thinking through things. And like you were also getting at, the categories that you gain in your mind for thinking after taking the Hegel class have practical ramifications. This is what's so weird. Like your categories of thought change how you act in the world. Are categories practical? Are they abstract? It's weird because it's both. Because the categories of understanding change how you do what? Carry yourself in the world. And so reading Hegel, reading these philosophy, change the categories you have by which to carry oneself in the world. And so then to me, a lot of the debate, something I wonder, because there is this very strange debate, like I think you're alluding to it, where it's like, is it material? Okay, like, because as I understand Dennett, and please correct me if I say anything incorrect, please correct me. Dennett speaks of illusions, but not like illusions, like they're helpful illusions. Like it's like color, like red is an illusion, for example, qualia, right? But he wouldn't say that makes them bad, or that they're not real in another sense, right? So there's a way in which the word illusion doesn't mean illusion, as I understand it, right? Well, then what's interesting, because you mentioned all those different theories of consciousness, I actually think that skill of being able to translate against different languages is a really important skill. Also, though, I will note, like a lot of people say, oh, it's all a language game. Well, wait a minute. If categories change practice, then language games matter. Like this is the issue. If we just say, oh, it's all a language game, well, that doesn't, no, it is a language game, but it's not merely a language game. The language we use changes how we act in the world. And so, you know, the issue I always have with Wittgenstein, now I'm not critiquing Wittgenstein, but, you know, the phrase, and it's a generality where the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Well, that would mean that the expressions of my language are the expressions of my world. So your language actually matters. And we got to be careful sometimes to say, oh, it's all just language games. Yes, but there are stakes. And so we got to kind of figure out, is there a better way to put this? Is there a better way to say this? Because here's the thing. If thinking somehow has some sort of effect on the concrete, and the concrete, the effect on the thought, and back and forth in a feedback loop that seems really hard to get your finger on, then the language we use will change how reality unfolds in a way, right? So now, of course, what do we mean by that? How do we think through that? Well, the stakes are very, very high. And so this is what I wonder. It seems like there's a giant debate on, it's almost like, what is more real, right? Like, which is more real? The physical processes that make possible the experience of color, or the experience of color? Which is more real? There's something about saying the physical processes that make color possible are more real that leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But then personally, I have a bad taste in my mouth when you say, well, it's just consciousness, right? Like a kind of panpsychism thing. Okay, so then this is the question. Is it an emphasis debate, right? Like, is it just a matter of what should we emphasize as like being more real than the other? This is the first question I wonder. Is the category of more real even sensible? Because if the debate, like there's a category of real and non-real, I guess you could say, or true or false, existent or not. But is the category of more real? Like, because I think Hegel's a monist actually as well. Now it's a complicated monist because it's kind of like, and I'm really opening a can of worms if I mention this. I think it's a monism like the monad in Leibniz, which is a situation that is fundamental to reality. Which then, what Leibniz basically wants to say is that the smallest unit of reality is not an atom, but a situation, which is the interconnectivity of basically consciousness with material reality, creating the situation of them dual informing one another. So like what a monad is to situation is what an atom is to things for Leibniz. I'm not saying that's true, but that's like a crazy kind of like, if fundamental reality is ultimately still situational, which maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but there's something about, I guess the first question is the category of more real. Is that a meaningful category if monism is at the end of the case? Can we even talk about that category? Because maybe a lot of the debate is assuming a category that's actually not sensible, like to talk about more real at all. I'm thinking live, I have no idea. I'd be curious how you respond to any of that.
Yeah, well, fantastic. I really enjoyed that. So this is one of the things I love listening to you and engaging with you is just how much broad context you provide, these little signposts along the way, often through your understanding of different philosophers and their philosophies, and be able to use those as some signposts, markers. And it just really helps to contextualize things. Thank you for that. Well, there's something just coming then directly to this issue about more real. Something that I've been thinking about deeply, which I know I'm probably wading into waters that I don't know very much about, is around the processual philosophy of Whitehead, things like that. When we tend to think about what is real, everything, an awful lot of philosophical conversations, and even the ones I'm having in my own head, the way that I see other people thinking about things, sort of collapses into the domain of being, what is, rather than, let's say, what does, right? And so what might be more real, or what might be a better sort of category of understanding or a way of a framework for operating within, is somehow bringing together these two seemingly orthogonal things between being and doing. It's not so much what is consciousness, but what does consciousness? What does it do? And it's not what does it do, as if it is a thing, right? You can really fundamentally reconstrue it in our understanding, even when we're thinking about it, is as a process, maybe a set of processes. I mean, consciousness is this unusual thing, as Dennett likes to point out. It's like in the beginning of his book, Consciousness Explained. Why am I writing this book? I mean, surely everyone's an expert on consciousness, right? Because we've all got it. But this notion of what we might talk about as consciousnessing, well, that's the phenomenon, not consciousness, but consciousnessing. And again, starting to think in terms of verbs instead of nouns. And there are, I'm only lightly touched on Whitehead, and he certainly goes the whole hog in a very kind of Bertrand Russell kind of way, and it makes it very dense. But there's lots of simple practical ways that we can think about that. It's like, am I having a conscious experience? Well, that's a noun. Or am I experiencing? Am I consciously experiencing or consciously experiencing? I mean, again, it can be very sort of jarring to think about it in some ways, but I think that's a better way to go. And now, when it comes to this frame of reality, one thing that Dennett did, coming back to a couple of earlier points you made, he is an illusionist, but precisely in the way that he said. And he said, people ask, well, are you a realist or not? And he's like, well, I'm a mild realist. And he's very, very good at playing these kind of seemingly slippery word games. But very often, the conceptual lexicon available, certainly in the 20th century, coming up after Ryle and Quine, and certainly in amongst his sort of peers and his interlocutors, he did a very similar thing, I think, that Heidegger and Sartre wanted to do, which is, let's just eschew all of these words that have got all these baggage in it. We'll just make some new ones, and we'll explain ourselves, hopefully, and we'll do it in a way that's kind of as baggage-free as possible. So Dennett is very much all about that, I think, and loves to invent new words, new concepts as aids to, as the title of one of his books, intuition pumps, things that pump the intuition about things that might help you to come to a, oh yeah, I kind of really get that. Maybe I agree with it or not, but now I've kind of got a new tool, a new way of thinking. And in fact, the very title, Intuition Pump, is itself an intuition pump in that regard. And he has so many of these things that do provide very useful tools for thinking, at least about certain, maybe about consciousness and other things from within that tradition. He talks a lot, he's a man who's written a lot about evolutionary theory, and that's something I studied quite deeply in the past as well. It's a very, very robust theory on certain levels of not just gene expression and, mutations and selection by environments. Take, for example, there might be a gene in a bird's wing that's in a cell in a bird's wing. We traditionally think of the environment as the air that the wing flies through. But actually, the vast majority of genes, and humans have about 28,000 of them, the vast majority of the genes are actually only operating at an intracellular level. So the environment for those genes is just the intracellular environment. And that's what's selecting in the environment for those genes and so on. So environment can mean a very broad range of things on different scales of environment. But then coming up to the level of the organism, he talks about the Umwelt of an animal, meaning from what I understand it, the not just the environment of the organism, but the set of things. Like for me, this cup here is part of my Umwelt. But if I had a pet cat, which I don't right now, but if I did, I have had pet cats. I love cats. If my cat was sitting here, this cup isn't part of its Umwelt. There's no way of relating with it. It's not going to use it to build a nest, like a beaver might see twigs in that way, or a bowerbird might see blue things in that way. So what is actually part of its sort of awareness in its environment, whatever its awareness is? And this is another thing I love about Dennett, is that he talks about consciousness as being a continuum from less to more. And we might be at one point in the evolutionary story, and he talks about that, for example, at very early primitive stages, being able to tell the difference between in here and out there. Now, a dog, when it's hungry, isn't going to chew its leg off, right? It's meat, it's fresh, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to do that maybe with its nearest sibling as well, unless, of course, it's extremely hungry, perhaps. But perhaps even down on the level of more primitive microorganisms, maybe even on individual cellular life, there may even be sort of chemical messaging going on that is in some sense a responsiveness to the environment, a responsiveness to self, as we might judge it, to that subject versus the neighboring amoeba. And that really is this continuum right from there, in increasing scales of complexity with emergent sort of internal tools, as it were, whether they're the chemical olfactory tools or sense tools, or right the way up into this plethora of tools that we've emerged in humans and other primates. Really, there's a lot of other primates have self-awareness. They experience shame. They experience extremely complex social interrelationships and awareness of the other. And if I'm sitting here as a little chimp and I'm part of this troop, and I'm noticing that Fred and Wilma over there are having a bit of a blue, and I can't hear them, but he's looking really unhappy with her, or vice versa. And I'm like, I wonder if such and such has happened. Now, they might not be thinking in English because they're chimpanzees, but maybe later on I'm going to go and find out, because it really didn't look like the way that he related with her was fair. So I'm going to go and cuddle up to her and just make sure she's all right. And I'm going to maybe do a little bit of preening or whatever that word is. And so you have all of these complex social dynamics that emerge long before we even get to things like language, and it does seem to be based on sort of the other, the perceptual awareness of the other. I read this book also by Daniel Halfman or something like that. He wrote a book called Shame and Pride, a work of the affective theory of emotion from the early 80s. It's one of the books, a landmark book that's given rise to a lot of these cognitive behavioral therapies and so on and so forth. And it talks specifically about the shame-pride dimension, and says that right even from the moment of birth as a human, you're like, you've got doting aunts and perhaps uncles and mothers and fathers going, "Cooey, how are you?" And it's like, and he's smiling up, and you've got these moments of a kind of positive reinforcement of it's not really identity at that stage, but it is still a connection to the other that's nascent in its emergence. And so as you go through, maybe you're the toddler in the kitchen that reaches up and touches the hot kettle, or you're just about to, and mum admonishes you like, "No, don't touch that." And you're like, "Oh, sorry." And so you have these moments that are like prideful moments and shameful moments, if you could construe it like that, that really this entire sequence of these over your nascent developmental life, these are what actually create the self. That the self is really largely defined by these interrelationships or interactions with the other. So there seems to be a lot going on here that, of course, that is non-verbal, and then we get to sort of adulthood, young adulthood, and college, and then everything very often makes sense through the lens of language, especially for philosophers, and so you can find yourself whiling away the hours chewing on concepts in English, if that's your language, in language. And that's something also I learned from Osho, just as an aside, was, well, okay, you spend a lot of time doing that, well, you better make sure you're enjoying yourself at least. Because if you're not, you may as well go and play tennis or go and play frisbee down the beach or go for a swim or do something else. There's so many other ways of being beyond just this mode of contemplation and consideration through conceptual exploration. So anyway, let me come back to Dennett for a moment. The umwelt of the animal is this sort of set of affordances of things that are useful within its environment. So when you talk about what is more real, I sort of began by talking about, well, do we want to really think about that in terms of being? It's like this conceptual apparatus. Well, what is it? It's just a set of relationships between concepts. But what are concepts? They're nouns, by and large. Okay, maybe the noun is the concept for an activity or a doing, right? Fair enough. But something very useful in the conceptual frame of thought to be doing being in your thinking. We talked before about the notion of, well, instead of human being, what about human happening? All right. So it certainly seems from the inside, something is happening, right? This is the most general sense in which I appear to be the kind of being for which something is happening, perhaps even more so than Sartre's notion of the being for itself, because it's still very much the being for itself. It's being again, right? Rather than doing. So, and I like to, we haven't explored it, maybe you can talk about this as well, your notion, you've been thinking about apprehending. Again, it's this event happening in the present moment of the conscious experience, or however you might want to describe that. And the reason I like happening is because it sort of has an applicability that is both first person and second, third person, sort of internal and external. I might be part of a group of event, like I'm at a sporting event. Something is happening that's beyond just the happening within me, like my happening. It's this collective happening. And so it has this utility and extension in and out of the first and third person, as it were, between the subject and the objective. That might make it more useful kind of tool. So again, coming down to the umwelt of us philosophers, rather than thinking about what is more real, then it might like us to consider what is more useful without collapsing into pragmatism in some way, because we want to keep it really centered in what is at stake, at least if you're trying to get at the heart of not just consciousness as some generic abstract phenomenon that happens to occur in humans, but this consciousness that I'm having as a human being. Like, can I come into a deeper appreciation of that? So that's where Umwelt, I think, is very useful. And then just talking, I'll close on this for now, is Dennett's notion of, from an evolutionary perspective, compared to, say, a modern educational perspective. He talks about the difference between competence and comprehension. So we're used to thinking of comprehension as, firstly, you digest the information until you comprehend it. And now that you comprehend it, you can go out about using it in a practical manner and hopefully become competent, right? And that competence grows out of comprehension. Whereas then it says, actually, no, exactly the opposite thing is going on. That really it's through layers of competence. And that competence might not just be some practical thing like how to ride a bike, for example. It might take you many, many goes in order to figure out how to do it. It's not so much, that's maybe not the best example either, but certainly in terms of thought, maybe I have to apply how to solve differential equations, and I'm going to do it 100 times. And by the time I get to do it, all these competence is built up over time. Perhaps even in the way like Hegel's notion of saturating a limit. You saturate a limit of competences, filled up with competence, and then undergo a phase transition into a new quality, which is kind of a comprehension or a mastery that is, becomes a kind of second nature, where you're not having to apply a kind of rule or a set of rules in order to be competent. Now it's just in me. And that's one of the things just to close then, is for me in my process, I've been, not so much, I could say, a lifelong learner. Again, what's that? It's maybe applying techniques of study and making sure I can comprehend things in order that they're really in here before I move on to the next thing, or perhaps a level of comprehension is required before I can get to the next level of competence, and so on and so forth. I haven't really had the time for that because, as I say, I'm not an academic philosopher, and I end up, when I do learn things, if it's not sort of directly applicable to my career choices, which is largely in corporate information systems and also music production, so a lot of competencies and comprehensions going along in those directions. Most of the time, when it comes to philosophical ideas or even scientific research and information, I try to just read it, absorb it like a sponge. So I don't think I'd be a lifelong learner. I feel like I'm a lifelong sponge, right? I just sponge things up. I don't necessarily, maybe I got 10% of it in terms of what I think I understood. Maybe I got 50% of it, 80% of it, depends on the material. But what I've always kind of trusted is it sort of goes in here to the great ocean of the unconscious, perhaps I could put it that way. It's no longer here in my short-term memory. It's like it's seemingly in and out, hopefully not in one ear and out the other ear, but certainly in the eyes and ears, straight through the conscious self into whatever the sponge is, and then just trust that an hour later, a day later, a week later, a month later, you're just in conversation or you're just engaging with something. You recognize that's just coming back out again. So it's not really this process of comprehension that's required for learning. It's just a process of absorption that's required by and large, unless there's a time constraint, you might really have to apply yourself. So this notion of competence without comprehension, I think, a useful orientation towards learning, towards new material, towards developing new categorical frames of thought. It's just like expose yourself to it, see what happens.
I think that was all just so good. I want to note quickly that what you just described, that is the key to reading. Like this trust that it's in me. If you don't have that, you become paranoid. You become someone who goes over and it's like, I want to make sure I don't get Hegel right. Oh my gosh. Hegel, if he was alive today, would not want you to read him in that manner. He would want you to read him in the trusting manner you just described. It makes me think of one of my favorite things Schopenhauer got at in The Will of Representation, where he's like, a lot of people in education today, the way that you're supposed to take learning, education, is there's a ladder and you see it and you climb it. And there are some rungs you leave behind, but you climb them. You go ahead. He's like, today what people basically are trained to do is take the rungs off the ladder and collect them in a bag. And you show them off. And he says, like, basically today we're using thinkers to bear them instead of being born by them, in a way. And I think to avoid that understandable mistake, because you're nervous that you're wrong, you have to fall into this mode of trust that you're describing. I don't think you can read. And another, you can't read books. There's another thinker who wrote an incredible book called The Finite and Infinite. Unfortunately, it's impossible, but he was really smart and I really like him. His name was Austin Farah. And he also had implications for educational reform. And he said that basically, like someone like a Heidegger or Aquinas, they would be horrified if they found out that people read Aquinas to become Aquinas scholars, as opposed to be inspired by the vision that they were on. Austin Farah says great thinkers want you to get on what they were on and carried by that. But today, instead of trying to figure out what like these great thinkers were on, we're trying to be a scholar, a Hegel scholar, versus on what Hegel was on, if you will, onward like a journey. And this is one of the reasons then why people are like, what they're like, well, why even read philosophy? Because they go into it with a mode to be a scholar, as opposed to catch the onness, the vision, the fire, the kind of going. And that's why they wrote, like, these thinkers, I promise you, Hegel was not going, oh boy, one day there's going to be Hegel scholars. Oh boy, I can't wait till people get freaking PhDs in Hegel. No, Hegel wrote because he's like, this matters, this is important, and this will lead people towards something. And it's like we have to think about, in the same way that when Tolstoy writes War and Peace, they have a vision that then carries them. We need to have our engagement with text make us like Tolstoy in writing War and Peace, where then we find ourselves writing something with our lives. But to do that, you have to have that mode of trust you just described. And to me, that cannot be overstated. It turns the book from an I-it relation in Martin Buber to an I-thou. Because what do you have to do with people? You have to trust them, right? You can't relate if you don't trust. There's a mystery there you can never fully access. And if you try to fully access it, you're doomed. So the I-thou requires a certain beholding and trust and vulnerability. That's how you're supposed to treat a book. That's how you're supposed to treat Hegel, an I-thou, but that requires the trust you described. So basically you outlined basically the paramount hermeneutic for going about a life of being a sponge, of learning, because that's what they wanted. They want us to be on. A few more things. You said so many really good things. Is that on this notion of process in the ing, reality is a great inging. And the problem is we're stuck in a language that suggests nouns. Basically, there are only verbs. And Hegel's kind of getting at that when he talks of we're in understanding, we have to move to reason, but the moment you move to reason, you're talking about it in terms that you understand it. And if you're trying to make a dialectical point, you have to talk sequentially about each side of the dialectic, thus making it sound like you're not dialectic. Crap. The way we communicate sets us up to suggest that reality isn't a great inging. And that creates all sort of problems. So the question of more real, it's almost like, can you talk about more real-ing? Are there things that are more real-ing than others? But then the million-dollar question is, by what standard? Like, what is the metric by which real-ing is determined? And you see, I think there's an assumption that tends to grow out of the noun paradigm, if you will, that the most real thing is what can exist without contingency. And so, for example, we tend to say, well, the bookcase is more real than my conscious experience of the bookcase, because the bookcase would be there even if there wasn't conscious experience of it. So therefore, it is more real, right? Now, of course, the problem is the moment I say the word bookcase, I've already conceptualized the frame in terms of a human what? Relation, right? So then you say, okay, that's fine, Daniel. The atoms of the bookcase. Well, atoms too is a conceptual model that you are using. So the entire statement of the metric of determining the more reeling has a conceptual framework running down the whole, right? But the opposite question could be asked. Does consciousness require objects to be conscious? And you see, it becomes tricky because we know that if you don't, well, it's tricky because we say, well, yeah, because if you were dead, you wouldn't have conscious experience, right? Here's the issue. Is it the case that because consciousness requires the brain or blood to operate, that means that it is contingent upon the brain, or is it simply require that object? And then we have to ask, what is contingent? Experience as such, or the mechanism that allows experience, right? And you'd say, well, there's no such thing as experience as such. And it's like, well, what about a dream? And you'd say, well, no, a dream requires a brain to occur. But what's very interesting is here's why it starts to seem like you have this problem of not being able to separate things. Because what's the revelation of a dream is that consciousness always whirls. Like, you don't just dream an object. You dream an entire world, and you're automatically in it. And what's very interesting is that thought in the dream shows you that when left to its own devices, it seeks a world that it creates, not merely single objects that you automatically assume as real, because lucid dreams are not possible, right? So there's also an issue that thought, we experience it in the world of objects thought as thought of, but in the dream, it's unveiled that thought doesn't just seek an of, it seeks an entire world ing, an active generation and following of a process of a world ing that you are in. And so what becomes kind of fascinating is the question of, when we ask, is the bookcase more real than the idea of the bookcase? The question is, where does the world ing of the bookcase and the entire framework by which the bookcase can even be meaningful begin, and where does it end? And that's where, too, it's like, so then it's like, well, then maybe by reeling, what we mean is the thing of which falls into use, right? Because we're talking about apprehension, right? So we say, well, the bookcase, it's almost like we want to say the following. It's almost, I sometimes wonder if it's like, it's almost useful to say the bookcase is more real than the conscious experience of it, because the idea that objects are real without consciousness contingency is itself useful, because like, it means I can assume things. It means I have a certain sort of ground by which to operate in the world, right? And what becomes really tricky is it's almost like if conscious experience of the bookcase is really wrapped up in the object of the bookcase in some profound way, that's existentially terrifying. And it's kind of useful to create a kind of hard split between those things. So there's also a use paradigm in operation there. And then the reason why also, like you say, it seems like use has a lot to do with reeling. But then the issue is use is not reducible to the use of the bookcase, but also the category of bookcase by which I can understand the object I'm organizing my use, because practical is always relative to what I believe is true, right? Like if I believe it's true that there's a crazy guy outside that's going to attack me, it becomes practical to lock the door, right? But what if the guy's not outside, right? Well, then what I thought was practical was actually an insane delusion, right? So what's kind of tricky about the use question, although it seems to be getting at it, is that in order to meaningfully talk about use, we have to know the truth that the use is useful relative to. And that then means, like, that means it's kind of like the thing that is presenting itself as useful brings with it a background of an assumption of what is true by which we can determine use, right? And so I guess this is the overall point. It seems like what is most real is the very movement of reality toward awareness. That's like, it's not the standalone object, but it's also not the standalone consciousness. Because, you know, the point is, right, like we assume that the object exists without consciousness, therefore it's more real. Well, what if consciousness can in some theoretical sense exist without objects, right? You know, there seems to be like, it seems to be able to create plenty of worlding and dreams, even though it like can't do that operation without blood. But then the most real thing that we seem to isolate in this experience is the movement of objects into a frame, like the movement of objects into use. Like the movement of self into use is what's most real. But that's, of course, like, it's not the use that is the most real, but the movement into use that is the most real. Like it's the very movement of things to you as then being useful, which then suggests that what's most real is this movement of things to a framework almost. And I guess what I'm trying to say with that is I agree in the monist framework. So, but like, as you know, in Hegel, there's this weird thing where nature and notion are two sides of the same coin. They're kind of, they're isomorphic. And like the monist situation of reality is this interrelation of consciousness and objects. So there's this kind of way in which if nature gave us consciousness, well, then at this point in the historic movement, it's the movement of nature into the use of consciousness or the framework of consciousness that then defines what is most real in this historic moment of reality. Kind of this movement into use itself. And it's almost like what ends up happening is when we're asking questions of what's most real, the object without consciousness or panpsychism, it's almost like we're thinking about it in a previous historic epoch, you know, before consciousness came in the process, right? Which then would suggest the assumption that prior states of the universe are more real than the current states of reality. But what if the metric of reality, what if the metric of what is most realing changes with history, if you will? Like it changes now to be, well, now that consciousness is here, actually what's most reeling is the movement into the use of consciousness, with use not being a pragmatic reductionism. I've said a lot right there, but there's some thoughts I have about the movement into the frame of use itself, more so than the noun of use, or the particular way that movement into frame that then can occur in this particular historical epoch, that then the question of most real should be thought according to those epochs. You know, because otherwise we're asking questions of most real according to past epochs or hypothetical situations, which then of itself is looking for a non-concrete background, if you will, because you know the concrete background is the historic epoch. I said a lot. Anyway.
No, this is absolutely fascinating, because a lot of this is stuff that I've been kind of pondering and considering myself. You know, there's so many ways of construing what is most real. Sometimes it could even be what is most visceral. Yeah. You know, what is most visceral in the moment. And there's a million ways in which human life can get extremely visceral, both positively and negatively. And let's give it a shout out for that reality. The reality of most people's lived lives, including my own, that sort of have this sort of visceral quality to them that sharpens the mind, it sharpens the intention, it sharpens your purpose to scales and heights and degrees that are simply not going on when you're sort of trying to work out what's real from a contemplative philosophical armchair, which I like to do a lot. So there's that kind of reality. But just really to what you're talking about, there is this notion in, I have a strong background in physics. I studied a lot of physics when I was a kid, and had a great fun doing it. General relativity, quantum mechanics, and over the decades since, tried to keep abreast of the latest developments, because it kind of all reached an impasse in the 1970s, and not really any great progress in trying to unify these two grand theories, other than a lot of superstring theory, which is just pie in the sky mathematics, more or less, with no empirical experiments on the horizon, perhaps potentially for centuries, based on any technology we can even conceive of right now. So what kind of science is it that can't be empirical, scientific theory, right? So, but there have been really fascinating discoveries, mathematical relationships between the two, that absolutely are fascinating. I recommend, if anyone's interested in that, to go and have a look up of ER equals EPR, which isn't an equation as such. It just refers to two mathematical papers, which strangely enough were both published by Einstein in 1935, along with a couple of collaborators. One was a theory about quantum mechanics, one was a theory about Einstein-Rosen bridges. It's the paper on that, in fact, aka wormholes. And now 60 years later, Juan Maldacena and others discovered this deep mathematical connection between these two branches. But anyway, I digress. But one of the issues around modern physics as this sort of paradigm way to talk about, well, as they say, fundamental physics, as if this is more real than everything else, right? Everything else is just kind of like fluffy descriptions on top, whereas, you know, the theoretical physics, that's the real stuff, right? The ground of existence. And yet there's something fundamentally problematic about it that's really been striking me strongly recently, and that is the conception of time as a dimension, at least as it's currently construed. This, you know, let's trace the trajectory of a ball that I throw the ball, and on an axis I've got time moving along the x-axis, and I've got height moving along the y-axis, and over time here's t equals 0 over here, and we can chase a parabola, and we can look at the mathematics of the parabola, and the ball lands 10 seconds in the future from where it started. So there at t equals 10, and now we've got this model of the parabola. So really the trajectory of the ball is the parabola. Now if you just take that and extrapolate it up to the entire universe for all of cosmology, quantum physics, and general relativity, it's essentially doing the same thing and resulting in a model of the universe really in both theories, which is, if not like the block universe model, the past and the future are really indistinguishable between each other, and the present is just a kind of anomalous, kind of like arbitrary moment that conscious beings are interested in for some reason that doesn't really seem to be there in the physics. But let's not talk about that, right? Problematic. I think the very notion of the arrow of time and the perception of time is pointing at some reality around time that is just, who am I to say, really, but that we've all been beguiled by, especially in physics. Likewise, even in quantum mechanics, you can talk about, and relativity, you can talk about time, the time symmetry, the symmetry of time. Time can go backwards as well as forwards. I mean, usually, mathematically, an electron moving forwards in time is mathematically equivalent to a positron, which is an anti-electron, moving backwards in time. Those are perfectly equivalent descriptions. You can really reformulate all of quantum mechanics in terms of a theory that's going backwards in time, and it's really the same theory, right? So no real accountability for, there are some people who talk about whether there are properties of the negative k muon in certain particular situations that might have a time asymmetry to it, and fair enough, all right, maybe there is some ground there for finding an arrow of time. But again, even this framing of things as an arrow of time, well, that's a noun. What is it? It's just a thing that's pointing, it's not doing anything. It's like it's like there's, the past is that way and the future is that way, and it's still static. And coming back to what you're saying, what is most real, it seems to me, is that at least for myself, and I'm going to assume for others, is that something seems to be moving. Change certainly seems to be real. Changing is happening. Let's keep it in the verbs, right? Changing is happening. I move my hand through space. It's like there's a sense in which something is moving in every moment, that time is flowing. And I think that that's a real oversight by not just the physics community, but by the materialist consciousness community. Another example in physics, just to end on the physics, is even when you look at something like Wolfram's, Stephen Wolfram's sort of Rulliad is because of computational universe model, and you actually even derive all the laws of physics from very simple computational rules. And it's okay, great, but it's like a kind of Conway game of life type system. Here's the rules, here's your starting configuration, now go. Well, what does go mean? It means tick the clock. And let's have the next step, and then the next step. But how do you get from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 10 to the 64? How do you get to those steps except by assuming that someone's going to run things, time is going to run? So time, in a sense, is just left out of it. Now, I could be wrong about that because I don't understand Wolfram's theories deeply enough. But I know he does talk about time, but it seems to me that somehow the moving of time is it's almost like the phenomenology of time needs to come in here and really start addressing these things. And even something like David Deutsch's constructor theory, which is another sort of reformulation of not just quantum mechanics, but thermodynamics and quantum information theory, all these sort of fundamental things unified, not so much in a deeper theory, but a new framework for discussing them in terms of, strangely enough, counterfactuals. What is possible and impossible, which might have some very interesting ties to the Hegelian negation of negation and so on, and sublation, blah, blah. But setting that aside, it still seems to me that the moving of time, okay, here's the theory, but someone's still got to come along and make something move in order to get from this configuration of a constructor to the next configuration of the constructor to the next configuration of the constructor. It's like, again, it's being left out. And one idea, which I'm sure is already out there in the literature in some way. In fact, maybe Lee Smolin in his book Time Reborn, which I've just started rereading. I don't actually think it's in the book, but I think I've heard him talk about it since publishing this in 2012, is what if you were, at the very least, this one doesn't get you all the way there, maybe gets you halfway there, that you were to reformulate time in the geometric sense, the Cartesian sense, where the time origin, t=0, is always kept in the present moment. So now here's my diagram of throwing the ball again. So rather than t=0 and the parabola is going this way forwards in time to t+10, it's actually it's like the time is always here in the center, and it's like the parabola is emerging out of that into the past, all right, to -10 seconds ago. Because we're here. I mean, we're here in the present. You're here in the present. I am. All the physicists here in the present. All the measuring equipment is here in the present. It's like, could we reformulate all our sort of even measurements? And I wanted, maybe this isn't the conversation for it. Maybe another time we could talk about the measurement problem in quantum physics and the relationship between that and scientific observation more generally, and the seeming irreducibility or irremovability of the subject in that which is, some physicists would regard as an incorrect way to construe it. Nonetheless, I think we know from Hegel that you can't remove the subject from the object, because the very notion of objectivity, even in the etymology of objectivity, is that it's like a pointing towards. But where is the origin of the pointing? Like from where is it pointing from? That is the subject, right? So the very notion of objective contains the subjective, right? So there's still something deeply there that cannot be removed. Did I kind of, maybe I can throw it back to you, but I wanted to talk about a couple of other things, like the notion that I have a couple of friends who are really into the Advaita Vedanta, and one of them asking me, it's like, thoughts. Thoughts are not real, as in the Advaita Vedanta tradition. But from my, study of the neuroscience and of Dennett and so on, it's like thoughts might be an abstract sort of category, and you might consider them a category of meme. It's memes that can be thought. Thoughts are types of memes in a way, but they are nonetheless. The way that I like to think about it is in terms of the neural correlates of consciousness, which I don't like that term at all, as if the neural activity and the consciousness are two separate things. Again, I'm a monist. I think they're the same thing. It's like, well, imagine every event or every experience that every human has ever had for the entire history of all human beings, which apparently there's something like maybe somewhere between 120 and 150 billion humans who have ever lived, and there's 8 billion of them alive today, over roughly 300,000 years, fully Homo sapien. Every thought, every emotion, every transcendent experience, every moment of curiosity, every moment of wonder, every moment of pure transcendent existential purposeful bliss at holding your newborn child in your hands for the first time ever, everything did have actual events in the brain and nervous system of that individual in that moment, like as Dennett would put it, like a symphony or a murmuration of a million birds coming into land. It's like that is the thought, that is the activity in the nervous system, and every single moment of human experience ever has had one of those going on at the same time. Because without it, you're talking about what's more real. Well, I don't personally draw a distinction between what appears to be my conscious experience of something beyond the brain state, which is itself built upon layers upon layers upon layers of reality, down through the chemistry, down into the molecules, down into the atoms, and perhaps there is levels and layers that could be infinitely deep in there. Who knows? But nonetheless, all of that is it, nothing more per se. I think it's very easy to get sort of beguiled by our sort of hall of mirrors of conceptual wandering about it, hence things like qualia and so on, I think. But setting that aside, where to orient from? And just I'll end on this. It's, we all look out of our eyes, as it were, conceptually, let's say, as well as literally, metaphorically, as far as the eyes can see, right, from here. And we all kind of feel, if I can put it that way, introspectively within the felt reality of the inner experience, whether that is just the reality of that I'm sitting on a chair and I can feel my legs and so on and so forth, the inner experience of me being the experiencing self. It's almost like that could go so much deeper in, and yet perhaps is limited by the cognitive apparatus of what is available to the consciousing machinery, to put it in those terms, and levels beyond or beneath which are not sort of consciously available in our species yet. Nonetheless, it's like the orientation point doesn't necessarily have to be grounded in some concrete physical reality. I don't think it needs to collapse into the physical reality. I don't think it needs to collapse into the consciousness, but as a loci of utility, if you like, that seems to be a much more useful sort of frame for considering things. Now, where is the point where there might be the connect between the experiencing self, the subjective experiencing happening, me happening, me dash happening, is that's happening, and the physical reality? Well, it could be that that point of interconnect is 4 billion years ago in the past, when life systems started to take off, or at least at some point with the emergence of nervous systems, at the very least, where there might have been some kind of store or responsiveness to the environment that is then happening in the lives of every single being through those roughly, let's call it, 2 billion years. And that's the place of connect, both conceptually and literally. As you kind of have to go all like this deep, sharp dive down one avenue all the way back to theories of physics, and then all the way and evolution and so on, and then all the way back down that 2 billion year trajectory, all the way back up to the inner life of this being that's carrying all of this within it, not just in the DNA and in the blood and in the bones of this living human being, but in all of the cultural and spiritual traditions of thought and value and ways of being that have come in to shape my, I'm not the author of the words I'm using, by and large, pretty much all of them. Where did that come from? How much, all of the things I said about shame and pride, it's like, what is this entity that is here in the present moment for myself, as it were, So anyway, plenty to
you said so much. So quick off what you just said, like, I think that model works very well. Because in the same way that we know you have a connection to your mom, even though you may not have any direct connection with her, because there was a point in the past where you were born by her, then you say, oh, there's always a connection, and the evidence of it is genes and different things. Well, likewise, if emerged to consciousness, at some point where we have evidence of a trait, because you have a brain and you have a body, right? The connection can have a historical point metaphorically, just like you always have a connection to your mom, and then her mom and her mom and her mom, and so on and so forth. So the connection can be historically embedded and presently relevant, in the same way that your connection with your mom is historically embedded, but it's presently relevant, right? And so, like, I think that's a very good model. I mean, the other thing with it all, what you were getting at with time, is a huge, huge deal. Because if we look at Bergson, who, Whitehead and Bergson can be read together, basically, instead of thinking space-time, we need to think time-space, where instead of time being relative to space, in Bergson, space is an expression of time. And you see, that's the critical difference, is that in Bergson, space is the way that time is expressed, and it is an unfolding. But here's the issue. If that's true, if the correct way to think about reality is more like time-space than space-time, that affects everything. So the word, the problem is, like, when we ask, is the mind or the brain more real? Well, right now we're asking it within a spatial structure, right? Brain and mind are separate. In reality, it's always brain/mind. It is always mind processing brain. Like, what is the brain? Am I the brain or not? And brain processing into mind, right? There is only processing. One of the issues, what's critical, is if we take the process thinking seriously, it's always processing. And the key is we not talk about process as the movement of spatial phenomenon through time. The things that are in the process are processing too. So it's processed all the way down. I think this is a bit of the speculative realism and delusionism and new materialism that's trying to be brought out by some thinkers. I know there's a debate between new materialism and dialectical materialism and Zizek and Hegel. I actually don't think it has to be the case. These things could be brought together, but that's another topic. But the issue is, so the other thing with it is, if the bookcase is always now in a processing, as an idea of bookcase, and the idea is always processing into the object of the bookcase, and it is the movement that is the processing that is most real, as opposed to a spatial object of the thought independent of the object, or the object as the thought, well, then that makes sense, because the basis of reality is time more so than space. So I think answering the question of what is most real is basically hopeless if we are talking spatially, or using spatial language or spatial metaphor. And the problem is, like, if we ask, is the appearance or is the idea of the bookcase more real, or is the object? Right there in the language, what you have done is separated them into independent nouns, ergo spatially, that you are comparing. Comparing a spatial act. So you've lost. You cannot arrive at reality through comparison. Because if reality is primarily temporal and different things, please, Peter.
This is, I think, the fundamental issue with the question, I think, from Nagel. What is it like to be a bat? Because, and then through the Australian philosopher who talked about the hard problem of consciousness, this is where I think it's fundamentally wrong to frame things that way, is what is it like, right? So you've got the it, and then whatever that's like. So you're already creating two things. The very question is proposing two things rather than one thing that is trying to get at. That there's a what it is likeness. It can often be put that way, and I think that framing of things, I think, is fundamentally misleading.
And the problem is, with that, you are assuming a space-time background. Like in the entire, like we were saying earlier, like the moment you say this is useful, there is a background that is assumed by which use is defined, right? So the moment we say, like, whatever is true, if there's a guy outside, it's useful to lock the door. So use is relative to truth. So the issue is, the moment we talk about use, which seems to have, I like the idea of a loci of uses. Michel Blondel will talk about action. So like a loci of actions, and action is a form of use because we determine action by. Here's the issue, is that the question then becomes the following: is what is the background according to which use is defined? If it is a spatial background, then use is going to always fall back, or could always fall back, into pragmatic reductionism. But if use is according to a background of time space, where time is by the unfolding of time, and what is favoring the unfolding of time is what is useful, not what helps us compare spatially, well, now we have a more metaphysically robust notion of use that then would align with a conception of consciousness and reality that can interrelate in these different things. And then the other issue is that consciousness, like if time space is so critical, and what you have then is that it's not like past, present, future, but you have the present is this unfolding kind of, there's a term Bergson uses, almost hologram, almost. I think it's hologram. And what a hologram is for him is that a hologram is every part contains the information for the whole. It's not that the whole is made of parts, but that all the information is contained, no matter how you splice up the whole, every part will contain all the information of the whole, right? So for him, time is like that. Every moment of time contains all the moments of time, which then sounds crazy, but not if time isn't sequential in the way that we think, right? If time has this interrelated unfolding, then this makes a lot more sense. And then this is the thing. If nature gives rise to notion, using Hegelese, or we say consciousness emerges or mind emerges, it's very difficult to language these things. Well, now what's interesting is that we have to then ask questions of what is most real relative to this moment of time, because this moment of time is the most real. So this is the problem. Like if we ask, like, well, and I agree with what you were saying with the mother and the historic moment, but some of the issues can be is that we imagine when we ask questions, is the mind real or is brain most real? Most is the problematic language. We tend to imagine a historic epoch where there was a world without consciousness. The issue is then that you are treating what? You're treating time sequentially. You're then actually falling into a spatial background without realizing it, right? So we have to go, okay, no, now is the reality. And what we see in reality is a place where it seems off to say subjective reality is not true, but it also seems off to say that material reality is panpsychism or something. Okay, well, then what you seem to have is that interrelation that is now. And so to ask about what is most real now, which is the only way to ask about most real, because now is real. And so that's got to be your basis of asking the question. Now seems to be where you have an emergence of consciousness that is precisely the move, like reality is then defined of the movement into the loci of action of which consciousness trace out. Consciousness kind of traces the point in which things can move into use, and then the way they then unfold into the next now is in accordance with that loci of use that then has a different unfolding into the future, because the future is radically open in a very contingent way, right? And so there's like, so now it's like what seems to be most real in this time that has consciousness is the ability of consciousness to move things into a kind of use that then is created differently or changed differently as it goes into the future than it would have been had it not been moved into that use. And I think focus is important, because focus is so interesting because it is not spatially bound. Like I can look at the bookcase, then look at my cup, then think what I'm going to do tomorrow. It's very able to kind of move in a way between objects, right? Now, it's bound to objects. It has some necessary relations to object, but we see in focus that it's not following time as if time is sequential in the same way. You know how we're saying, like, the temporal experience of focus itself does not suggest a spatial concept of time, right? Well, then focus then can be a kind of, focus then has some sort of isomorphic suggestion of the way that then nature can unfold as it moves into the loci of use that is traced out by the horizon of consciousness, which then means that what constitutes most real is that movement into loci of uses, because that is a unique characteristic and quality of this historic moment now, and now is the most real because it's time-space, not space-time. And so the movement of unfolding itself becomes the reeling, the most reeling, if you will. And that's what we need to focus on, but we're asking these questions, and I think then falling into problems, because we're actually, when we ask the question, what is most real, we are doing it then through an epistemological method of comparison, which assumes a space-time background as the truth, so that is a sensible activity. So then it's a mistake all the way down that then leads to all sorts of mistakes. But if instead in the background you say, no, it's a time-space, space is an expression of time, and what you have is the spatial differences is a different unfolding of time. And what is unfolding in this moment of time is the movement of nature into a loci of use by which is known in notion that then changes that unfolding or influences that unfolding in different ways. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse. And then the last thing I'll say and give it back to you is you were making the outstanding point that for genes, evolutionary, it's more intergenetic. It's more inside, not just environmental, Well, likewise, a lot of thoughts are intermental. Like there are thoughts that are not just of, but thoughts of thoughts or thoughts to themselves. And so what ends up happening is you have an intermental space that then can move into a thought of the bookcase that then changes the thoughts in the inter. So you have a feedback loop between these two things. And what defines the present moment of unfolding is the feedback loop between those two different interspaces. The intermental, you can say the physical world, or the intergenetic, like they're going back and forth, and that movement into one another then becomes the defining feature of this now, which then becomes a justified basis of determining the reeling, the most reeling, assuming that it's more time-space than space-time. And so I think assuming the wrong background, and then I'll give it to you, has made it very difficult to even ask these questions, because we're assuming a space-time, and thus time is relative to space, and thus it's a block universe for Einstein and all these different people, as opposed to an unfolding hologram where every point of the now contains the information of the whole. And so then the part of the bookcase contains the whole of the idea of the bookcase, and the bookcase, the idea of the bookcase contains the whole back and forth, and you have an interrelating unfolding that is occurring. And so it's that very movement that then becomes the processing by which we can ask questions of most real. I'd be curious your thoughts.
I absolutely love all of that. And it really kind of aligns with a lot of things that I've been trying to wrap my head around, just thinking through myself. And it is this kind of like, again, as someone who's done a lot of kind of the way I see it is this nouning and considering and collapsing into being and the comparative stuff is almost like a kind of horizontal axis of reasoning about things, right? Whereas the vertical axis is the time axis, let's say, the one where we're moving through time. What are my intuitions about things? How does intuition arise about things? I love that you use the word focus. How do I stay focused? How do I stay on point? That's the task I was doing. This is the purposes that I have that I'm bringing to the present moment, and they're future directed, and they're based on my plans of action. And so orienting myself around the time axis seems to be a great deal more purposeful, useful, productive in all sorts of ways. And then when I sort of think about the past, I mean, we don't know if the past still exists. The theoretical physicists say it does, but if it doesn't, there is really the present moment, and this movement, this moving, that is the moving happening that's going on. Then everything that you know, that you learned, is this storehouse of knowledge. Every memory and experience that you have, the storehouse of memory and experience, perhaps karma and things like that, and also what gets in some vernacular laid down in the emotional body that's there still exerting its force here in the present. Well, all of that is essentially, I'm just going to call it past, but it's all available. It's like this palette of tools and things that can just come forward here on task, on purpose, informing the intuition, informing the reason, to actually carry things out in the world, to actually bring about change, to create change, to not in the maybe there's a couple of different modes of change we're talking about here. One is this notion that things are changing, moving is happening, right? That's time. I think a more valuable way to look at it. But then there is me bringing about change, changing my understanding, changing my environment, changing my relationships, changing my work projects, musical projects, and so on. It's like bringing that into being, birthing it into some. Well, it seems like a contradiction in terms, but to birth it into some future now. Actually, well, I'll be in that now, so it will be birthed then, as it were. But it's got to start somewhere and come through into being, into happening, into nowing, into
Well, what's so fascinating with the, not to interrupt, like with the Bergson, like the past is then always pasting, like it is a present activity, and so the past contains, as a hologram model of time, contains all the information of the present and the future, but it's not in the kind of block universe way, because that's a spatial metaphor, but it's in a hologram way where it's not that the past. It's not that the past exists before the present, because when the past was happening, there was no present which it could be before, right? Like, like when you think back on the past, you say, oh, the past was before the present, but the past did not experience the present as before, because the present was the future relative to the past. So we forget that when we ask the question. So we got to keep so the past is always building up or containing or unfolding the full information that will define it when it becomes as the now. And a way to think, like, there's a way here to maybe think that the now is the zero, like the negation, like the now is a negating principle, but the negation is substantive, because the negation is always a sublation, right? The fact that like the now is always negating the now that just was is why the now is all there is. Like it is.
That's what I mean by the t equals 0, always being updated to the present moment, and just to sort of adjust the geometry, as it were, and the coordinate system around that. So you're always keeping that in the present moment and tying it into that Hegelian notion of the absolute concept, really.
Absolutely. And I think Bergson, that's exactly what the now becomes. Like the issue is, like, Bergson tries to point out, and then I know like Bard and different people talk about the ecstatic now, the eternal now. You have this and this emphasis on the now. Like for Bergson, we've misunderstood like the Zeno paradox and all these different things. They don't unveil that now is an illusion. They unveil that now only makes sense non-spatially. Like now is now is the concept that involves that you can't, it unveils that you can't think of time according to spatial metaphor. That's the irony, is we've tried to describe time according to spatial metaphors when you should describe time according to temporal metaphors, right? But here's the problem, we don't know what time is. We think time is just is relative to space. And so we haven't actually looked at what time is. But if you look at what time is, you go, oh, the time is a hologram, and space is an expression of that unfolding of time. And then what this means is that time has texture. Time is substantive. Like what we tend to say is that space has texture. I can pick up the pen. That space is like, no, actually you're picking up time expressed in space. You know, you are feeling space. Time is no longer a dimension over space, because what is that? That's a temporal metaphor. Time is, you know, Bard will basically call time God in this kind of like absolute idealism way. Like time is basically the deepest principle that you are always operating with. So what we have to realize is that if time is the deepest concept, time isn't what we think it is. Time is not, well, this is the problem. Time then is not a dimension of space. Time is the
space-like dimension.
Exactly right. Time then is the unfolding itself. Everything is unfolding. That's time. It is the change itself that you can't, but here's the key. You can't think of change spatially. That's the problem. We think of change spatially, so we don't actually know what change is, because we say, oh, you know, my hand moved here, there was a change in reality. It's like, no, there wasn't a change from space. There was a changing that then the past isn't there to say it changed relative to. Okay, so it's the changing, but the past is in this changing moment because it is a hologram that contains all of the information. Well, then we have to apply, this is the key, we have to apply that entire metaphysical framework then to the question of the mind-brain problem. To, is the mind or is the brain most real, right? Well, guess what? Like that we say, oh, well, the brain changes into the mind or it emerges to the mind and all of these different things. Well, here's the issue. You're using a spatial, you're saying there's a spatial change or something changes in space. No, the active emerging is occurring. The brain, it's always mind/brain because it's the active movement of those two that is unfolding through time. And time now is a moment where brain and mind unfold together. And it is that very unfolding together that then becomes the most reeling, because the very thought of those things unfolding together then moves into the loci of use that then changes how you act in the world, because you think things, so it's acting together. And the practical implications of that is where you go, wow, I'm able to think thoughts because I have a mind somehow. I'm going to invent air conditioning. I'm going to invent a car. I'm going to have a family. You have ideas in this interdimensional space that then changes your action in the world. And because you have that thought, you now come to be in a world. Time then unfolds as a place with cars, as a place.
Likely, well, you might end up somewhere else entirely than where you thought you were going to get to.
Yes, because of that intermental activity. And so the unfolding then shows that it is not reducible to the intentions that you thought you were, because you could end up somewhere differently. So then the surprise becomes a kind of intimate dimension of the unfolding of reality. But that very surprise is only possible because of the interrelating between mind and brain. And I am noticing that I'm doing a crazy glitchy space thing on the Zoom camera. Yeah, man, look at that. Oh, did I slow down? There we go. So that's good. So the thing is, like, the interplay between mind and brain that can surprise you because you end up somewhere you didn't think you would. That very surprise then is a possible feature in a historic moment where there is an interplay between mind and brain, because that very interplay makes it possible for things to occur you didn't expect it. And and then the key is you could almost say the surprise is most real in a way, or most reeling, because it is the thing that is only possible due to the interplay between brain and mind in this sense, that then is not reducible to either brain or mind, because neither expected it, and yet it wouldn't have occurred without it. So it's almost the purest example of processing. Like the surprise is almost like the purest form of processing in a way. Please.
Well, I mean, that kind of comes back, and I was thinking about sensing, and in particular, the fight or flight mechanism, or let's put it another way, the opportunity threat axis. I mean, is that a leopard in the shadows, or is that something I could eat that I might want to go and predate? It's like, so the threat opportunity system baked into our lowest level of our physiology, I think, and a very one of the most fundamental systems or principles within us, because it's what has allowed all of our ancestors who reach reproductive age by and large without getting eaten. So, you know, when it comes to what's most important, how does that express itself? I think that's something expressing itself on the time axis, you know, and again, how immediately can we process, how quickly can we come to make a decision, because time might be very short indeed, to avoid catastrophe, which sharpens the mind. So, you know, I just wanted to sort of mention that, but I'd lost my train of thought about where I was going to go with that. So I'll just pass it back.
Well, I'll just say what's so interesting to me is the radical role of surprises in evolution, like the ability to be able to be prepared for surprise. Well, what's so interesting, surprise seems to be a very pure expression of time space because it's unpredictable, right? Well, what is most unpredictable? Time. But space, like when you think spatially, it's not surprise. Like space is compare and ready for and there. Time is more so what you would align with surprise. And what's interesting is if evolution seems to be so strongly connected with the preparedness for surprise, right? Or ready for surprise. And that would make sense if basically reality is more time space. It kind of metaphysically aligns. Biology kind of aligns with metaphysics. And then what's interesting is use then is defined by what is most useful for surprise. And I like that because it helps us avoid use being raw pragmatism, because you don't know what your surprise, you know, you don't know what is useful. But what is useful then, and we've been talking to Ivan Illich and the distinction between prepare and plan, and where today, to keep our humanity, we need to be more prepared than plan, which would align with this. Like, so what is useful is that which you discern and judge for some reason you need to bring into your loci of action, because it raises the probability of being prepared for something you cannot plan, but you don't know that for sure. But for some reason, you've made that assessment. But that's weird. How do you make that assessment? Based on what standard? What seems to be an interplay of your mental processes. You've said, well, this is possible, therefore I will adapt or prepare accordingly for surprise. And then it's very interesting, because then what you see in evolution's fate being so strongly tied to surprise, and say human fate to surprise, well, that would align with a metaphysical conception of time being like deepest reality, right? So basically, survival is tied for what's prepared for an expression of deepest reality, which is found in the surprise. But we don't, like, by definition, the surprise is hard to quantify or to measure or to test, right? Like the entire way of testing what is real tends to then, in its background, bias space, because I can set it in the laboratory and look at it and I know it's there and I can compare them. But the act of comparing to determine reality assumes a background of space-time as the truth. But if instead it's the preparation for surprise is the most useful, and in that sense the most reeling, because surprise is the greatest expression of time space. And almost what's interesting with that too is preparing for surprise means you're toward the unknown. You're toward that is yet to unfold, because you're always mentally and consciously toward that which is yet to be. And maybe
it's almost like towards a reality which will come about in the present moment and perhaps look nothing like what your planning and predictions might have expected. So how else can you better prepare for those the inevitable arrival of the future present into the now that defies your expectations and so on? It's like that's what can you bring to the present moment in all of your future present moments. What can you actually bring into that by way of preparation?
Well, it's fascinating too, because I think a lot of times people define most real by predictable. What can you predict? What predictions can you make assuming it, right? If you can make accurate predictions, then therefore it is real in different ways. But that all there is a space-time background. But what's fascinating here is, in a time-space background, what is most real is being prepared for the unpredictable. It's a state in which it will seem like you predicted the thing when it occurs, thus making it, and then it will confirm it was most real, but it's actually most real from a place of unpredictability, preparation for, and maybe that's the most, dare I say, conscious act, or that's the act at which we need to look at to see the concrete and the abstract come together. Like that act of preparation for the unpredictable might be the kind of neurons or brain activity that start to kind of show, in a way, this connection between mind brain, because when the surprise occurs, it's going to be what? Very concrete. The surprise is not going to be experienced as an abstraction, and yet you are toward it as an abstraction at the time. So it's this weird thing where you're toward an abstraction that, if it occurs, will be concrete, that then isn't concrete at the time, that you are defining your present moment according to, and that you are defining your loci of use in light of. So it's this so the preparation for the unpredictable act, which seems to be the logic according to which evolution occurs, what genes happen to be prepared, according to the unpredictable, that is almost the same logic of consciousness then. Like the consciousness that is able to be, well, I mean, the humans that are prepared for the unpredictable are probably going to have babies while others don't. There's almost, maybe you could even just kind of blow it down to an evolutionary structure. Like your ability to have thoughts that make you prepared for the unpredictable probably increases the likelihood that your genes will be passed on, if I'm to speak very generally. Wouldn't it be funny if that's basically the same, like if that's what biology does? Like what genes are prepared for the unpredictable? Now, basically what we have to do is think thoughts for the unpredictable, because time space is the background, not space time. So please.
Well, there's wonderful books by Nassim Taleb, is it? He has one book called Antifragile. Sort of one of his books is sort of suggesting that the capacity of systems, people, philosophies to cope with chaos and volatility, that its capacity not just to cope with them, is actually benefiting from them. It sort of goes beyond a normal sort of notion of resilience or robustness for something. It's actually a system that thrives under stress, thrives under uncertainty, under randomness, improving its capability of resilience under those conditions. And so that's perhaps a very useful way to think about conditioning our own attitudes, philosophies, and so on and so forth. Although perhaps even within all of this, it's very easy to sort of slide into pragmatism again, isn't it? Still looking for some more ontological certain ground here, are we not, for the nature of reality and conscious experience and time and the relationship between those things. So again, I was thinking before, this is more perhaps on the more pragmatist side. It's almost like nature is saying, do the best you can in the time available. And right now you've got 5 seconds, go. Or you've got 5 years, do a PhD, write your heart out. So it's again that thing where the 80-20 rule, the law of diminishing returns. It's like, how much am I going to invest in the preparation versus in the getting on with it? Because once you get 80% of the prep done in 20% of the time, and 20% of the prep done in 80%, it takes 80% of the time. It's like, well, actually I could just be getting on with it now. So there's a certain I don't want to say ontological value to pragmatism, but there's certainly a great utility to it in perhaps leading a more flourishing life. And the perfect is the enemy of the good, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of important value to pragmatism. And where does that line between ultimate and I think also the notion of focusing on certainty, what is the ground of reality, or the totalizing worldviews, and this kind of often unconscious thirst for them, the danger of certainty. It's like we were talking before, perhaps there is just this inevitable Dennettian process of competences that leading to comprehension, which is really just to to saturate a limit into a new quality of comprehension, which then becomes more and more and more competencies, and so on and so forth in this process of negation or saturation and limit and transition from quantity to quality. If we were to look at that here in the sort of process we're going through of trying to come to this more ontologically sound framework for the nature of existence and reality and self and consciousness and time and so on, that we might take that rather than the certainty is what then would allow us to then reach some new place of utility. It might be that saturation of utility and usefulness is actually what's going to bring up the saturation of a limit into a new quality of certainty, and perhaps that's really what's going on. And so we might say it's not just competence without comprehension, it's utility without certainty, at least certainty of applicability.
100%, because, well, the issue is that it's almost like you can talk about an open pragmatism or a temporal pragmatism. So the basis is that, yeah, without pragmatism, you're in huge trouble because there's no possibility of preparing. And what's interesting too, you mentioned antifragility. Well, antifragility only makes sense as like the peak act of like evolution or consciousness in a time-space model. Because like chaos, like being prepared for chaos and benefiting from chaos, or the unknown, or like things you don't know that are going to occur, well, that makes sense as such a high principle if it's time space where it's completely open. And so being ready. So then anti-fragility is the most practical mode by which to be toward a reality that is time space versus space time, because you can't know how the unfolding is now. And what I would say is, it's like what you're doing is not searching for a transcendental ground, but for a now. Like it's like it's like the now is the ground, but the now is a grounding. And the key with the now is that in 5 seconds it could be different. Like a transcendental ground must be always the case. And what we've been suggesting that is like if the standard of most real-ing is historically contingent on the moment of what is present and what is not. So what is most real-ing in a world of just no brain, no consciousness is different from one with consciousness interplaying with objects. Well, likewise, the standard of pragmatism is a now that could change in 5 seconds. So this is the weird thing. It's concrete, but open. It's very concrete. It's not like wishy-washy, but it can change. Like it's a changeable concreteness. So this whole search for a transcendental ground is based on what? Spatial metaphor. Ground is a space. But what the issue is, the negation sublation of the search for a transcendental ground is a now, a capital N now. I want to say transcendental now, but maybe an unfolding now. Like that is, but that is a good transcendental ground per se. That is a good basis to search for. Giving up the transcendental ground must lead to, because otherwise you're going to be chaos and don't know how to be prepared for the unknown. It must lead to an observing of an open now. I'm thinking of a way to learn an unfolding now. And pragmatism then becomes an open pragmatism relative to that unfolding now. And this is why pragmatism then requires some dimension of phenomenology, observant, concrete experience, because you need to be in tune with that unfolding now, precisely because it is changing, and you can't just learn an abstract theorem and then have a transcendent ground by which...
Apparently also empirical updates as well, sort of constantly updating itself on the latest and best available information. So it's an informed pragmatism. Yeah.
Well, an update is such a good word because the act that is then most real-ing is the updating. Like we've asked but what interesting is the movement, the act of the updating. The act of prepared for surprise, these fringe moments of where concrete reality turns to be different from the idea, and yet the idea is ready for that encounter. That seems to be the moment of most real, because that is the moment that confirms time space most so. And if time space is most real, it is the basis of all of the universe more so than space time, then those moments where the concrete hits the mental, where the mind hits the object, and there's a break, and yet the mind is ready, it's not overdone, but there's a meat. So then it changes the unfolding. That then unveils that we are not spatially bound in a way, or spatially determined, or everything relative to space. It's all an unfolding of a now, according to which we can meaningfully define a pragmatism, a non-reductionist pragmatism in a sense, or a non-spatial pragmatism. Now you have pragmatism and creation and creativity come together. Like creativity and pragmatism then kind of blur in a very powerful way, and in a good way. You almost get a creative pragmatism, a pragmatic creating, these things come together. Please.
How about instead of the Hegelian absolute knowing, we come to absolute nowing?
Absolutely.
Unfolding, yeah.
There is no doubt. I think it is extremely important to read the philosophy of right as a defense of the now as the basis by which to think. Like Geist needs to be thought as a primary temporal justification, where philosophy needs to think the now, and the basis of political society needs to be the now. Definitely absolute knowing is a realization of the ultimate unknowability of the future, only the now, and that the point of philosophy is reconciliation, as Dylan was saying, with the present, to be ready for the openness of the now. And absolute knowing is accepting that limitation, but creating with that limitation. Because here's the trick. So we're saying, like, if time is there's always been a kind of limit, like the limit is now. The noumenon is the now, but the noumenon is part of the phenomenon. And so it is not something that keeps you from reality. It is the defining edge of conscious involvement with objects, with the material world, is defined by the now. The now is the noumenon, but the now is something you are part of, because you are part of the unfolding. So you're part of the noumenon unfolding, and that unfolding of the noumenon, the thing that limits you, is the very thing of which then makes you limitless, because the limit is part of your frame, and you are only limited by the limits that you impose on yourself, which is the limits to your creative act. It's the limits to your ability to then, to be anti-fragile, basically, because this would be the point. Like then, like,
but just on that point,
please.
right there is the Hegelian aspect that a thing is what it is not. So yes. The limit is also contains within it the very notion of limitlessness. The now contains within it the very notion of what it is not. If you like, it's not just static. Right, so those things are perhaps ontologically built in, if Hegel's right on those levels.
Oh, and I think anti-fragility is a wonderful concept, because it is kind of the practical way to think the is not, the is and the is not together. Because when you're anti-fragile, you are anti-fragile, but you're also not the thing that's going to surprise you. But that's precisely why you're anti-fragile. Like the concept of the thing that's going to surprise you is not part of you. You are not that, but that is why you're anti-fragile. And this is the funny thing, is that these particular acts of thought, I think, suggest the most the truest expression, I get, of thought, is I am right now being what I am because of what I am not. Ergo, I'm not able to predict the surprise. Therefore, I'm this thing that's not able to predict the surprise, right? And the thing is, there's always in thinking that tries to be prepared for the unknown, which we're saying has a parallel in the evolutionary process in of itself, that has a kind of is-notness in it. Because you don't know the thing, like you're not a being that can know everything. That's why you're anti-fragile. If you could know everything, you could plan away everything that could surprise you, right? So there is an inherent notness in the act of preparing for surprise, in the same way that there's a kind of inherent notness in kind of time space, because it's not the space that it manifests. It is the is not. Like the problem is with when time is relative to space, then time, it's not is not, it's time's not. It's just a relative, right? What is space. So there's is and there's not, and they're separated. But in time space, what's interesting is you have the is not, where it's unfolding together. Time space is a manifestation of time, which is not time, but it's also is time. The notness of space is actually the revelation of the isness of time. And so you have
time, literally.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so there it's like individual alignment with that metaphysical conception would be things like anti-fragility. And then
it's interesting.
Please.
Sorry, go ahead. It may be that there's many people in the world, ways of, types of people that for some of whom these thought through, considerations could just be second nature for them. And so even recognizing sort of the diversity of types of human life that can be lived, that have been lived, that are being lived, that are people who otherwise might not be engaging in sort of philosophical thought with other people and putting it into those sort of terms. The reason I mentioned that, which was a very big digression, but it was to come back to the example of, say, an American football player. He's the receiver, and so the quarterback's throwing the ball, he's powering up the pitch, he's got all his protective gear on, so he's anti-fragile in one respect. He knows how to run well while looking in the wrong direction. There's another sense in which he's kind of got a lot of practice of how to navigate a potentially tricky and muddy terrain while keeping his eye on the ball. And he's certainly not himself within his own consciousness in that moment, and is he going to get intercepted in the way before that ball comes in and before he can catch it and look to the direction of which he's going? So there's a whole sort of sequence of ways of being in there that are very much in the moving now, very, very present in the moving now, and yet very, very well prepared in the way that we're talking about. So there's a mode of being. It might be that there's many, many others. Maybe, a particular kind of Japanese chef who's kind of chopping with his knives at high speed, or something along those lines that's got to be so extremely well prepared for the unexpected that it's just a way of being and how to be in the world. And of course, even things like martial arts practice and so on have an aspect of that in.
I'm very glad you brought this up, because to me, like, if, on this kind of question of the most real or the most reeling, the flow state is the most reeling. Like, that is when consciousness, because that is when mental and matter, you can't separate them. They're blurred together, and it's the greatest alignment with time space. And we seem to be truest when we're most alignment with what is, and what is a time space, and the flow state is the most like that. And flow states, to stay in flow states, required an antifragility, because otherwise you get interrupted out of the flow state and you shoot back into consciousness of I suck, I wasn't prepared, and now you've lost the resonance with the basis of reality. And so the flow state is the act of which is, the flow state then is also, I think, critical because it's a space of self-forgetfulness. Not self-degradation, not ego focus. There's a third category where yourself becomes like a thumb. If you think about using your thumb, you're kind of weird. Like there's a pathology and, oh, I'm using my thumb right now. No. The right way to use your thumb is to not think about it, right? So, and Timothy Keller talks about that, and it's a really useful thing. Likewise, consciousness is at its height when you don't think about it. But not because you get rid of it, but because it is so immersed in an activity, an objective empirical activity, that it basically becomes that empirical activity. And the heightened unfolding of that activity is only possible with a mind. This is the key. Like nature can only unfold according to a flow state, thanks to notion, to use Hegel's language. So then the flow state is a kind of pinnacle example of time space, unfolding, interrelation. And so consciousness is at its height when it forgets itself and making possible an unfolding of nature that nature couldn't do without notion. And so notion is at its best when it negates itself into a sublation as nature. And so notion, like consciousness in a sense, then exists to be negated, to be forgotten. But there's a difference between forgetting and not having. Nature could not monistically unfold as the flow unless there was a consciousness to forget, because consciousness is at its best when it negates itself to then let nature flow according to that flow state, if you will. But if nature never had notion, it couldn't forget the notion to then make possible the flow state. So it's like the brain needs the mind. If we use it, all these different languages, the brain needs the mind so that it can forget the mind and be at a heightened activity it otherwise could not do. Well, that just applies to all of nature. It needs notion to be able to unfold as itself monistically. So then notion exists to negate itself in an act of forgetfulness that then makes an unfolding of nature that otherwise could not occur. Please.
It reminds me somehow a little of Kierkegaard, and there's something deeply ironic about the whole philosophical process itself, because it's on this kind of quest to understand, let's say, at least in part, the nature of conscious awareness.
Yes.
It's like consciousness looking itself, as Sartre put it, consciousness of consciousness, awareness of awareness. And so it's like being at a fairground ride and stepping into the Hall of Mirrors, and now being effectively, if not lost in the Hall of Mirrors, hopefully maybe having a good time in the Hall of Mirrors, but nonetheless you're in a Hall of Mirrors, and that's kind of like most of philosophical thought about the nature of consciousness for 2,000 years.
And this is huge. So I'll use the notion nature language of Hegel, because I like that with whole game.
And sorry, just to say, it's ironic because it's maybe seemingly coming into the most deepest connection and discovery and inquiry into the nature of consciousness and the reality of consciousness, which perhaps is what everything is kind of affected by, and yet at the same time taking you the furthest away from reality because you're now no longer in flow states.
This is 100%. So the choice is between negation or irony. If we do not negate notion, you end up in ironies, where you're trying to learn consciousness, and the very act of trying to learn about consciousness then results in you not knowing what consciousness is, because you're stuck in spatial metaphors and comparison and the wrong epistemological tools. So if you don't negate, you end up in irony. And I think as a side, it's interesting, like many religions kind of seem to have a suggestion. You have to humble yourself, die to yourself. And if you don't do that, then you end up in the wrong framework. And it's interesting how you kind of sometimes in mythos, you have that kind of structure. But the thing is, so notion, it has to negate itself. So in this historical epoch, it is possible for notion to negate itself so that nature can unfold as a flow. If there was no notion, then flow states would not be possible in this way. I'm not saying there couldn't be instinct or different things, but the creative character of the flow state would not be possible. So the introduction of notion, which I'm not trying to be, you have to speak as if you're talking about a dualism because of the nature of language stuck in understanding versus reasoning for Hegel, but I'm not. It's all the same substance, monism. But the notion makes possible the unfolding of nature, which is fundamentally a time space and thus fundamentally an act of unfolding. Notion makes possible in this historical epoch a different quality of unfolding, which is the quality of flow, that is possible from an act of notion negating itself into nature, which then nature is defined by the quality of negating notion, which is not the same of never having notion. And it is precisely in that negation then that the quality of nature's unfolding is according to a flow state, of which is only possible in the historic period in which there is notion. And so then the most reeling act would be the most reeling things, the most real things would be that of which contributes to that schema. Whatever is in favor of that schema then is what we can say is most real, because it is that of which is most possible and most uniquely possible in this historic epoch in which notion can be negated. So I think the issue is we've been asking questions about, is notion or nature most real according to the wrong physical background of time, of space-time. We've also been asking the question according to different historical epochs in the past. Instead, and we've also been asking it through acts of comparing objects in space as opposed to following unfoldings and movements. But if we shift then to time-space as the background, then most real is a movement. Then the most unique movement of this historical epoch would be the most real according to this historical epoch, because the only standard of defining real is the now, and what is possible in the now is the flow state. Ergo, the most real activities are the acts of which negate notion into nature so that it unfolds according to a flow state, which is then maintained by being anti-fragile. If you are anti-fragile, then when something hits you unexpected, you're not taken out of the flow state, you just moving into the flow state and keep going. So then anti-fragility is the preparedness necessary to keep the flow state going, ergo the different unfolding of time space of nature notion together in this historical epoch.
Well, yes, so bringing that all the way back to where we started at the beginning was like, that is the marriage there of being and doing. And yes. It's like bringing the historical context of your own past, as it were, pasting into the moment, applying it within the flow state, and not trying to stay in there, but actually being capable of staying in there because of the preparation of the antifragility. And in a way, what we're almost describing is a musician.
Yes.
It's literally like perhaps not just live performance of a pre-written piece, but a live performance of a piece that is emerging spontaneously on the piano or on the instrument of the musician, and then doing that perhaps in the sort of mutuality of the flow states of your of fellow musicians on bass and on drums and on flute and on whatever it is. You kind of all have an ear to the rhythm and the direction and the space, as it were, musical space that the other performer is taking up, while simultaneously bringing forth your own goods without the mind getting in the way, without even trying to push it out of the way. And just the practice of all of that, it's almost like this. It's like needing to be musicians as a way of being in so many other areas of life beyond being a musician.
That's the metaphor. I think that's it. The now is a jazz improvisation. And like, so then also too, like the ability to maintain, so you could say nature now can possibly unfold like a jazz improvisation, which I think is the same as the flow, which its ability to maintain the improvisation is the ability to go with the flow, whatever occurs, which is an act of anti-fragility. And this also then suggests why you need to study like Lacan and psychoanalysis, because you're ready for the real. And when the real hits, it doesn't destroy the music. It doesn't stop the improvisation. You're able to keep going. And to the degree you can keep the improvisation keep going is to the degree that you in your life can maintain the most real way of being, per se, the most reeling way of being given this historical epoch in which time is unfolding with nature and notion together. And so then like it all, yes, sir, please.
I was just going to mention also, freestyle rap, it's like sometimes rappers get into these flow states where it's just coming through for long periods of time, and they're the experiences, especially even for the audience, the most championed and appreciated when the rapper can stay really in the flow state, especially with they're spitting a lot of truth and a lot of meaning that makes relevance and sense in the lives of their audience. So
well, and then I think basically we need to take the hip hop cipher as the model of community today, of political organization, of organization in general. Because what the cipher is a circle of prepared for the unknown, and the cipher is a model of time space unfolding according to a flow space. And so what is that? So then taking that as a model for thinking political, economic, and lots of different things. The cipher is central as a model. And then like, are jazz improvisations practical? If we go, wait, there is a practice, and there are things that are practical for being good at jazz improvisation versus not. So now we have a negation sublation of spatial pragmatism as open pragmatism as jazz improvisation. The ability to improv is practical. Like that is the standard according to which you need to define what is practical for you, is the ability to improv. And that's also, I will note, probably like the quintessential human act. Like improvisation is probably the most human things we can do. And basically also, this would seem to be, to me, what we need to do to have our own line of flight in Duluth to avoid capture and not to be reduced to AI algorithms. Now, I'm not anti-AI or computers, but there's this $1 million question of how we can have technology extend our humanity versus replace our humanity, Well, if we take seriously everything we've been saying, then the way you extend the use of technology is by having the human element of the use of technology be the improvisation according to which the technology serves, and then back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. But in order to have something that humans do that is unique from AI, we have to then redefine what we consider practical to have a lot to do with improvisation, have a lot to do with time space. Like the whole model that we're putting forth then makes AI not so much an existential risk. Now, I don't want to get into the whole Molark, super intelligence books. I understand that's all that. But right now, the kind of very basic question is, well, what good are humans if AI can do everything that humans can? Well, guess what? AI can do everything humans can following a space-time model, like a space-time metaphysic. And you see, when you change that, then AI, I'm not saying AI won't one day be able to create stories or different things, but what you see is the human can then add the indeterminacy, the open pragmatism to the use of the AI to help us avoid the existential replacement, takeover, or different things. So basically, like the technological paradigm that's coming forth really requires this rethinking of what constitutes most human, most reeling, and all these different things, so that then we can see these things as a blessing instead of having what to me right now, a lot of the technology conversation is very simplistic and it's kind of like either or, and I'm not an expert in that field, and I'm not trying to say there aren't foreign policy risks with like hacking and all that. That's a different subject. The main thing is there are a lot of people right now that are almost like depressed because they're like, wow, we're just going to be replaced by robots. Well, yeah, if your model of reality is space-time, but if you can flip that, then AI is simply the champion of the space-time universe, and the human can add the element of the time-space indeterminacy, and then you can see how the technology can help extend humanity and this creative unfolding versus replacing. So to me, I'd be curious how you respond to that, because I know you do work in that field, but I feel like so many people are like scared to death of AI, but I feel like this thinking of the human can kind of help not lead to that kind of pathological response.
I think you're exactly right about that it's a space-time thinking, as it were, with AIs. I do not think the current breed of AIs are on a trajectory towards AGI, as they are, because they don't include anything like this Hegelian negation sublation process. I think I was listening to this fascinating talk with Eric Weinstein and Stephen Wolfram from just a few weeks ago, and somewhere around the 1 hour 40 mark, I might send you a link. Weinstein started talking about a whole bunch of things where she was like, well, we kind of reached this impasse in theoretical physics. It just really sounded like Hegel, and he used the example of the invention of the square root of -1, which is the number I, which stands for imaginary. So it was built right there into the name. It's like we're kind of stuck at an impasse trying to think about things just on this kind of, let's say, single axis. And the only way you can get through that is just to come up with something completely new that will just open up a whole new space, in this case of numbers. And then through that, it's become incredibly useful to create fields and dimensions of exploration and explanation within scientific theories, like things like Hilbert space, which is what quantum mechanics is heavily dependent on, is a space of that has at least one dimension of imaginary numbers or an imaginary axis in it. So there's a lot of things going on there. And I wanted to mention something before that you talked about when we were talking about improvisation. Well, what it takes to be great, to be in that flow state for a long period of time, to be a great improviser, if you like, for, even to stay in that space, is just practice, isn't it? And there's seemingly no shortcut. So it's just the literal application of your skill sets, of your exploratory, of your creative, of your thinking outside of the bounds, of literally just doing it, just getting on with it and doing it and practicing and hopefully honing your skill or improving your capacity, not in some dry manner, but towards the capacity to be in flow states. That seems to be the right way to orientate and direct your practice in whatever area of life that it is, in order to get to the successful improv, as it were.
Well, and that then goes to the process stuff we've been emphasizing, because practice is a mode of life that is processing. You're always in the processing, just like time space is always processing. So you're aligned with reality. So this is the funny thing. Like, in a way, the empiricist materialist thrust is we need to align our notions of reality and the way we live with how material reality actually is. There's a brute sense in which, a simple sense in which materialism is the effort to get humans to align with the material world, right? Well, then the question is, what is the material world, right? Well, turns out it's time space, not space time. So then a negated, sublated notion of materialism as ethic is then moving us into a life of practicing, improvising, because the material world is more like the new materialism. I think there's some, with the Deleuze and different things. Now, that's an entirely different debate about many things to many people. But sticking to the time space stuff is like practice then, like materialism then is aligning with time space, because material reality is an expression of time space. And the best way you can do that is to engage in a life of practicing, which is getting good at improvisation, which means you are then ready for the future, which for Hegel is reconciliation with the now, which the whole goal of philosophy is to be ready for the indeterminate future, in a way, like that absolute knowing. Well, then the most practical way to live following that is a life of practicing. So then you're ready for the completely open future, which then in Bergson, that's completely the case, because it's the creative, it's totally creative. And so then a way to think of like what you were saying with Weinstein and Hegel, there's a way to look at the phenomenology as the exhaustion of space-time. It's where understanding moves, assuming space-time, and gets to the place where it say, oh, we've reached our limit. Wait a minute, if this limit is here, oh my gosh, it's actually time space. And now we move into the logic. So there's a way in which the mind has to work through thinking as if reality is space-time, because if a baby was born thinking time-space, they'd probably go crazy. We, like evolutionary, we require the error to function. And that's why Hegel said, and that's why Hegel's like, the fear of error is the fear of truth. Like, you literally require the error of understanding to be able to move into reason. But what's happening is it's like we've moved now out of a kind of metaphysical infant. Like space-time was what we needed as a metaphysical infant, if you will. Now, as adults, we need time-space, or else we regress, and we have certain pathologies or different things. Please, Peter.
Well, that's one of the things that Patrick Susskind developed in the late 90s, a theoretical physicist, works at Stanford, with the holographic principle. And the work around that time of Juan Maldacena and others over the last 20 years, looking at this deep correspondence between some of the mathematics from quantum mechanics and some of the mathematics from general relativity, to do with, on the one hand, what appears to be wormholes in Einstein's language, where you have, black holes that come back to a point of infinite density and infinite gravitational curvature, and if even light can't, if it comes close enough, it doesn't simply have the velocity and to avoid being captured into a black hole and sinking down into some point of infinite density. But perhaps on the other side of that, Einstein and Rosen speculated that there would be a geometrically opposite phenomenon, a white hole. But let's not forget about whether something's falling in or falling out. It doesn't really matter. The geometry of it is just that there is perhaps two sides to this thing, and that tunnel in the middle is something that, can it be traversed? Could information pass through it? And all sorts of other questions. But then from the holographic principle, it talked about how you could have a boundary of space that, even something to say the size of a baseball, of a basketball, let's say. Now imagine we're just talking about something in the vacuum of space. You might think that there's more degrees of freedom within the three-dimensional volume of the baseball than there might be on the surface of the basketball than on the surface of the basketball. But what the holographic principle shows is that no, for various other properties of the physical universe, there are an equal number of degrees of freedom within the three-dimensional volume of the basketball than there are on the surface of the basketball. And now, in fact, you can just represent the three-dimensional volume in terms of a two-dimensional surface. That has, and effectively you can consider that what we can see here, I mean, you and I are not in the same three-dimensional space right now. Perhaps space-time might be another way of putting it. but this sense of the three-dimensionality of it, let's just stick to three space for now, is itself really just a projection from some infinite two-dimensional boundary.
Right.
That's the hologram, is the fact that it's experienced in three dimensions. Now, I can't remember why I was diverging into all of that, but it's essentially this great impasse between the space-time view of Einstein and the quantum mechanical view. And in fact, in that view, in that other paper, which was also authored by Einstein, unbeknownst even to him apparently, there is this paper about quantum entanglement. And really the degree of entanglement of something, of two particles, is itself that space is really just a phenomenon that we experience as space is really just an emergent property of the degree of entanglement of matter. And that the mathematical relationships between these things are now, again, where what do we have? We have a thing, we have another thing, being sublated into a new thing. And that's really what is going on right now in theoretical physics. A lot of developments in the last 20 years that are maybe looking to breach this seeming impasse and distinction between quantum mechanics and general relativity.
Well, I mean, what would be crazy is if like time space is the case and the word geometry has to mean something different. Like geometry, like geo, like space, like geometry suddenly becomes like origami. Like it has to include the unfolding. Like geometry, like we say, when I think geometry, I think circle, square, and different things. I don't think the unfolding of the circle into a square, the square like gaining different textures and different things. And what would and then time doesn't become a dimension, it becomes like a quality of the thing that is unfolding, right? So then the weird thing is geometry would have to include the movements of the geometry as a characteristic of the geometry itself, not in a dimension according by which to think it. So geometry then becomes more like origami, I guess. I'm trying to think of a way to, the unfolding or those things in middle school where you can move it. Like geometry then has a movement characteristic to it. That is it. Like right now we would say, it's a square, right? Or I would say, if I were to take the piece of paper that I'm going to turn into a origami crane, I would go, what is it? I'd say, oh, it's a piece of paper. Actually, if time space is the case, it is the becoming of the origami. Like it is the folding up into the origami. It's not the origami though. That's a mistake. That would give a temporal bias to the final point. No, it is the folding into an origami from a flat piece of paper. That is the thing. That is what it is. And so like in time space, like when we talk about the hologram model, where it's all kind of like the two-dimensional emphasis in different things, well, then in time space, it's like, yeah, there's a two-dimensional base, but actually it's the becoming of the two dimensions into the other dimensions, because an essential quality of the hologram is that becoming, is that folding up, if you will. But you see, we have a bias to think of time as a dimension. So that can't be what it means. It has to be a hologram then in a kind of illusionary thing. Because we think, oh, but really it started off two-dimensional and then folded into a crane, an origami crane. Therefore, it's really a flat thing. Well, you're biasing the past. You're not treating the now as the most real. No. It folded into a crane, right? And then when it's a crane, it has the potential to fold back into paper. So the always present potential of unfolding is then the most real. And that has to be included in the geometry, not just seen as a dimension. And the most real is a geometrical state that is spatially understood. So then what it would mean is like Leibniz would talk about meta geometry and different things. And that's the difference. Like what it means is then you have, it's like the origami. Like you have to think of these shapes, including their unfolding. Like all shapes become what? Shaping, right? The only geometry is geometry, right? And so the time dimension is the most real. And so that would transform geometry into something that has this improvisational dimension to it in its character. And so
not so much the time dimension. Again, it's not the time dimension that's most real. It's timing.
Yeah, and it's so hard to
moving,
say.
Changing. So we just don't have. I think this is where this is perhaps I'm going to be exploring this more fully. Is what else is out there? Around the conception of other conceptions of time that don't just ultimately reduce it to something static, which is essentially to reduce it away? How does it remain? And maybe it is something like we were saying about consciousness, that you know, you were saying either you end up in the ironic or in the
negation.
practical.
Yeah.
And it's like, so it's the same thing with time. It's very we end up getting very ironic about time, and it seems like physics is entirely ironic about time in the way that it's just presupposed to a certain understanding of it that is, look, has a great deal of practical utility, but is it ontologically sound? One might ask. I'm not sure that it is.
Well, space-time is an extremely useful practical model. It is an extremely useful map. The issue is that, I guess, getting into belonging again, is that the limits of it come out when you encounter difference, pluralism, complexity. Like, you can't just think of reality according to the space or town that you grew up in, and that's the most real, because now you end up in tribalism and pluralism collapses. Like, what ends up happening is, as you reach a historic moment where you encounter greater difference, you must identify with the unfolding of that difference, or you're going to have an I-other dynamic that leads to political collapse or different things. But if the unfolding of your community into like a time-space conception transforms political life, it transforms sociological identification. It changes what you identify with. I also think this has massive implications. I've been doing work with Andrew Luber and Alex on storytelling, because stories are thought of as sequential events versus unfolding of themes. And so we don't have, and that's actually ruined storytelling. We actually don't even know what a story is. I know that sounds bizarre, but we're still following an Aristotelian model in the same way that A is A logic is an extremely useful model, but reaches limits. The conception of story we get from Aristotle is useful but limited, and it's exhausted. And so now you have to have a conception of story according to time space, or theme story, where the theme becomes and then we basically have to redefine what theme is, because it's not just a moral, it's a deeper principle that is always in all moments of the story at once. And so we have to rethink story, you rethink politics. I think you rethink friendship as well, because friendship is not what we used to have, or are we still like we were. The friendship becomes the honoring of the unfolding of the relation that is able to maintain the flow state, that is able to meet whatever is the now. So like how we value friendship starts changing. It becomes less susceptible to nostalgia.
Well, just stories. I mean, we can think about them as these sort of written things. I mean, a story is a thing that you write down, and so on. You can speak it, like in indigenous traditions. They have a verbal tradition of passing on the story, but the story is also that which is heard, not that which is written, as it were. It's the very act of hearing the story that is then giving life to the story in the mind of the reader, of the listener. So perhaps there is somewhere, that's where the life of the story, and it brings me to this other notion about the difference between the messenger and the message.
Absolutely.
So these two things have a tension between them. On the one hand, the message, the information, the narrative, this kind of static thing that lives out there, and then the messenger as the one that is speaking it, that is telling it, that is actively communicating it, and then of course who is receiving it as well. So you have the act of comprehending it, and really it's only then when there's an actual transmission of meaning, of perhaps even of value. It's like that it's that transmission that becomes the sort of the live act of creation. It's the movement of the story, of the information, of the message across the sort of boundary of the individual into a new individual, where it comes alive again in its own right. So there's perhaps something there in what you guys are talking about of what is a story. It has to be both, and all of that.
That's 100%. And definitely oral tradition leads itself more in the direction of flow, time, space, while written is spatial time. It lends itself in the direction of a story is something that can be dissected. Where no, a story is at its best when it cannot be dissected, because every point contains all the information of the whole as a kind of hologram or different things like that. And I, alas, my beloved friend, in about 10 minutes, I'll have to go. This
Absolutely love it.
This has been a joy. And like you mentioned tension, and basically you can't have time space where there isn't tension. Like tension is the very quality of the presence of time space, or your alignment with time space. Antifragility is tense, Flow states are tense, like improvisation is tension. So this is the funny thing. Tension is tension as opposed to anxiety, because we have to make these distinctions. Anxiety is almost when you lose tension, actually, and like in a funny way. So like tension is precisely a quality that you are alignment with time space versus space time. But that's precisely because you could screw up. You know, if you're doing the football game, you may drop the ball. If you're doing the jazz improvisation, you could miss a note. So alignment with time space requires risk. That's Nassim Taleb. You have to have skin in the game, you know, antifragility. So the funny thing is, we need to ask questions about what's most reeling relative to risky situations, where actually we tend to ask them within static situations where there is no risk, where we freeze all the variables and there is no tension. And that's precisely the opposite place to look for reality, unless reality is space-time. But if reality is time-space, then you look for reality and metrics of most real in the tense places, in those places of risk where there could be a mistake. And then what you see in the places where there could be a mistake, the way that the human being is able to maintain an optimal state of where there could be a mistake is by being so well-versed and well-practiced that they're able to go forward without thinking about it. Ergo self-forgetfulness, ergo the notion is negated, consciousness, mind is negated into pure brain, of which is only possible because of the conditioning of mind, of which allows something magnificent. Something where you're the NBA player at the final drive doing, you know, I remember watching Michael Jordan live on his last game when he was sick and all that. You know, like the extraordinary athlete, the extraordinary ability to respond to the unknown, like this kind of magnificence emerges. You know, I've talked about beauty. The fate of beauty is the fate of us. Beauty is not merely pretty, but this kind of moment of magnificence. And that seems to be this kind of glimmer of time space. This kind of glimmer of the proper relation of mind and brain together in this kind of glimmer sort of thing. And so really then for us to be most reeling is for us to live lives practically that are practicing to be able of those moments of this sort of glimmer of time space that is dynamic and alive.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I always enjoy listening to you and talking with you. It's always so incredibly rich and so much sort of laterality to it, and so much to follow up on as well. And some of those last things that you were saying as well, it's like, you know, sometimes the comprehension in this case has come quite you know, fluidly and easily around some of these issues, but I can also recognize for myself that actually the competence in a lot of these things, or actually to integrate them, to actually practice it, to actually think about how to, or to engage with my life in a way that you know, is towards these the practice, to the improv, to the flow state, and see, you know, historically how well I have or haven't done, and how much potentially I could do better, and what the value of that will be for me in a practical way. That's very, very exciting and daunting at the same time, but something I love leaning into, is how to bring this philosophy into my own, or these kind of considerations into my own life, and change and evolve.
I feel the same way, Peter. Well, it is a complete blast. One of the things that actually kind of gives me hope for these, you know, some people have called it liminal web conversations and spaces, is that it allows this possibility, like the athlete goes on the game, then they go to practice to improve, then they go back, this kind of integration. I feel like these spaces actually allow that in intellectual life in ways that perhaps were not so easily possible before Zoom and all of these. And like that ability to integrate philosophy into life and to go back to try it again and refine. Like maybe you could do that as college, like the seminar versus the discussion, but I don't think it's quite the same. And even if you did get lucky and get a few classes like that, after you're 24, you don't get any more, when really we need it our entire life, because we always need to be practicing to align with that time space. So one of the things that gives me kind of encouragement is precisely how these kind of conversations in the liminal web and whatever people philosophy for and different things actually kind of lend itself almost better to that, you know, conversation, practice, think about, return, revisit, go back and forth, back, so we can actually get better. And I find that gives me a great hope in different possibilities. Well, this has been magnificent. I don't know where the time went because it was a flow state. So alignment in different things. And thank you so much for your time. This has been a treat. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. And thank you.